Hello and welcome back to Zenin Fanfics. Today we're starting part 2 of the series. What if Deku became the most feared villain? If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe for more content. The story we're featuring is written by Toast the Spaghetti in the Oven on archive of our own.org. You can find all the relevant links in the description, so be sure to check out the author's profile and say hello. Now let's dive into the story. Dabi exited the smell of booze and loud music as he walked down the street, taking his smoke break. He pulled out a cigarette and put it in his mouth. Dabi flicked on his finger, and as the blue flame burned his cigarette, he leaned against the nearest wall. He shook his hand, putting out the flame. Dabi pulled the front of his AC/DC shirt up to make sure it was covering most of the scarring on his chest, then did the same with the sleeves on his jacket. He couldn't cover everything, like anything on his face, but he still wanted to cover as much of his scars as possible. They were a reminder of him and all that he did to not only him, but his mother and siblings. Dabi took the cigarette out, blew some smoke, then put it back in before putting both of his hands in his pocket, and began enjoying his break. Dabi checked his watch to see that he had about 10 minutes left. He looked down the street only to see someone familiar. His eyes widened as he realized who it was. The sun was setting, so it was understandable to see the one underground hero he didn't want to see. The hero, by the name of Blast because of the small energy blast he can shoot from his fingers, was walking down the street. Whether he recognized or just noticed Dabi and was suspicious of him didn't matter. The moment Dabi saw that he had caught the hero's attention, he got up from the wall and as casually as he could manage walked further down the street. "Hey," Blast called out to him. "Hey, you stop," he yelled. Dabi ignored the hero and just continued to walk as he picked up the speed. He heard the hero's footsteps behind him come jogging up to him. There was a hand placed on his shoulder. "I told you to stop." Dabi tried to appear as calm as possible as he turned around, hands still in his pockets. "Sorry, didn't hear you," he said as he took his cigarette out and dropped it on the ground and put it out with his foot. He blew smoke in the hero's face. The hero took a step back and coughed as he waved his hand around his face to help in dispersing the smoke. He then started looking Dabi up and down and all around, a question looking to form on his face as he started to get a better look at Dabi. And Dabi was beginning to feel uncomfortable as the hero studied him. Did he recognize him? Dabi pointed to his left with his thumb, back towards the direction of his job. "Hey man, do you need something? Because I kind of have to get back to work soon. And I would really like to actually enjoy the rest of my break." He slouched his shoulders as he put his hands back in his pockets and stared at the hero. After 2 seconds of no answer, Dabi just turned to start walking. "Oh yeah, go ahead," Blast said, seeming to come back into focus. He stepped back a bit more and put a hand out to wave and signal that Dabi could go. "Sorry, it's just you look familiar, and I just can't put my finger on it." Dabi looked away, trying to avoid eye contact as he chuckled a bit, trying not to sound nervous. "Happens to the best of us," he said as he started speed walking as fast as he could down the street. That must have been the wrong move, though, because he was almost at the door of the bar when he heard the hero yell behind him. "Wait a minute. Stop." Dabi was definitely not stopping. He started walking faster. "You're that guy?" "No, not me." "You got the wrong guy," Dabi yelled back. "Yeah, that guy that almost set me on fire the other day after stealing my jacket." Dabi started running, looking back only after he felt something skimming past him and burning the side of his leg. Dabi fell to the ground. The hero was running towards him, fingers pointed at him, ready to shoot a blast. Dabi threw up a wall of fire as he tried to get up as fast as possible. He dragged his feet closer to the door of the bar, holding the bleeding skin on his leg. Dabi winced from the pain as he felt another blast burn his other leg. He collapsed to the ground again. Dabi looked back at the hero, who was walking towards him with a cocky grin on his face. He lifted the weight of his body up and turned to face the hero. Another blast skimmed the side of his leg, bringing Dabi back to the ground into a kneel. Dabi shot out a burst of his blue flames. "Damn it. These were my last clean pair of pants," Dabi yelled at the hero as he lifted his hands from his legs to see them covered in blood. "Well, maybe you shouldn't have stolen my jacket," Blast yelled back, shooting through the flames, just barely missing Dabi. "I thought we were past that." Dabi put up another wall of fire. "You try to set me on fire." A blast from the hero went through Dabi's shoulder, and he hissed in pain. Dabi produced as much fire as he could to hide him. The fire bullets from Blast just shot through no consideration for where they would hit. Some went right past him, while some just barely hit him. Only a few went right through him, but fortunately, they weren't any vital points. Dabi's quirk was starting to burn him a bit, and Blast was still sporadically shooting his quirk. With all his new wounds, he doubted he was going to be able to work, especially since he wasn't even able to stand. Blast's quirk was grazing him and shooting past him. Then it suddenly stopped. "Who are you?" Dabi heard the hero yell, followed by the sounds of a fight. Dabi turned off his quirk hesitantly, putting the firewall down, and saw the hero. He was just fighting, losing, against trying to dodge a knife after knife. Some short dude wearing a suit, this weird smiley mask, and a black leather patty cap was just trying to stab Blast with these two dagger-looking blades. And he didn't look like he was losing. "What are you doing?" Blast yelled at the new fighter in the arena. He pointed to Dabi. "He's the villain here. I'm a hero." The short dude, a kid maybe, stopped his pursuit towards the hero and looked over at Dabi, who was just kneeling on the ground watching them. Smile Mask started walking towards Dabi. "This dude stole my jacket and then set me on fire," the hero pouted. "I almost set you on fire," Dabi corrected. It didn't matter, though, because Smile Mask still continued to walk up to him. Dabi put his hands up ready to defend himself from the knives that were probably going to start coming his way. Smile Mask passed one of the knives from one hand to the other and raised his free hand, almost like he was telling a hurt animal he didn't wish to hurt them. Smile Mask came all the way up to his face, looking directly into his eyes. Dabi felt like he had no need to fear this short guy holding knives, but at the same time, his presence was intimidating and almost seemed to loom over him. Smile Mask started circling and looking him up and down. "Back up, dude," Dabi said in annoyance as he lit his hands. Smile Mask jumped a step back, looking almost startled for a bit before continuing to examine him. Smile Mask gestured to his neck, hands, and face, then pointed at Dabi. "Your quirk do that?" Smile Mask asked with an unexpectedly deep voice. Dabi scowled and lit his hands. Was he being pitted now? "Yeah. So what? You suddenly feeling bad for me all of a sud. See, he even looks like a villain." But before the hero could even finish his sentence, Dabi watched as Smile Mask threw a knife without any hesitation at Blast. Blast looked down at the knife, now buried in his chest. "Wah!" The hero coughed up blood. He looked up to see Smile Mask running towards him. The hero put out his fingers to blast him, but it wasn't fast enough. Smile Mask dodged Blast's hands, then thrust another knife up into the hero's arm. Blast screamed in agony and slowly started backing up. The hero held the arm with the knife in it as he continued to cough up blood, trying to talk. "Who are you? Why are you doing this? Are you the one?" The hero repeated over and over while sliding his feet backward. Smile Mask reached into the inside of his suit jacket and pulled out another knife and approached Blast. The hero's eyes went wide, and Dabi could swear he saw tears coming out of them. Blast threw out his hands, pleading and crying for mercy. Smile Mask remained silent, though, and just continued to walk towards the hero. Blast tripped on his own 2 feet backing up, and when he hit the ground, he shot out a blast. It missed any actual target and only hit the building behind Smile Mask. The hero screamed and cried in fear and tried getting up quickly as Smile Mask was closing the gap. Smile Mask launched himself at the running hero and pierced a knife into his back. Blast only faltered for a second and kept trying to run. Smile Mask kicked at the hero's knee, then grabbed at the knife in Blast's back. He stabbed the hero again, then again and again until Blast was laying on the ground and blood pooling underneath him. Dabi watched as Smile Mask dusted off his nice pants, then pulled out a phone and took a picture of the body. He pulled out a notepad and crossed something out on it before taking out the knife from the hero's back and arm. Smile Mask kicked Blast over so he was laying on his back now and grabbed the last knife buried in the hero's chest. Dabi went to get up off the ground. Trying to stand, he found himself being caught by the small killer as he started to fall. With an arm draped around the guy, but the urge to push him away, Dabi pointed to the door in front of them after "Where can I drop you off?" was asked to him. Smile Mask brought him up one of the rooms above the bar and dropped him off into a chair. "Can you get the first aid kit?" Dabi said, probing at the wound in his shoulder and seeing blood cover his fingers. "Where?" Smile Mask was already searching the room for it. "There's one behind the bar counter, you," Smile Mask walked out of the room before Dabi could finish. A few minutes later, he came back with a red box and tossed it at Dabi, then just stood there staring. Dabi reached into the kit, getting out bandages and tape. He went to grab at his jacket to take it off, but hesitated. Although he felt a little sense of trust with this dude, especially after just being saved by him, he still didn't really like the idea of showing his scars off to someone. Dabi looked up to ask him to leave, but saw no one. He heard the door click shut, and a faint smile formed as he took off his coat. After patching himself up, he limped out of the room and was surprised to find Smile Mask sitting against the wall, cleaning his knives with a rag. Smile Mask stood up and put all his knives into a sheath that was fastened onto the inside of his suit jacket. Dabi wasn't really expecting him to still be here. Did he want something from him? Thanks, I guess, for saving me. I wasn't saving you. Just doing a job. You just happened to be there, came the deep voice from behind the mask. Okay. Well, then why help me and hang out afterward? Curiosity. Dabi raised an eyebrow, and Smile Mask must have sensed the question forming. About you, he said while pointing at Dabi. Dabi had no clue what he would be curious about. Was it the scars? They could be a bit off-putting to some people. Dabi tried to pull his jacket farther down his arms to cover what he could as he dragged his body over to the stairs. Smile Mask followed him. What did he want? What was he curious about? Want a drink? Dabi didn't hear an answer, but still made his way down the stairs and behind the bar ready to prepare a glass. Hearing if they had any tea, he looked up to see Smile Mask sitting across from him. After some preparation, Dabi put a cup in front of Smile Mask and poured him the hot leaf juice. Smile Mask lifted his mask, but not enough to see his face. He took a sip, then put the mask back down. You said that your quirk caused all those scars, came his deep voice. You pitying me? Dabi scowled. Smile Mask shook his head. No. Then what is it? Smile Mask chuckled. Like I said, curiosity. He lifted his mask and took another sip before putting it back down again. You have a fire quirk, but not a fireproof body. It wasn't a question, but Dabi understood what he was trying to ask. The fire is from one parent, and my skin is the result of the other parent. That satisfy your curiosity? Yes. Smile Mask chugged the rest of his still very much hot cup of tea. Dabi went to grab the kettle to refill the cup, but when he turned back around, Smile Mask wasn't there. What a weird dude, Dabi said as he grabbed the empty cup. Never caught his name, he thought as he began to clean it. Izuku finished writing out another plan for one of the next of many victims. He was honestly quite surprised this whole killing business thing had picked up so fast and well. He just wanted to kill people with power, and turns out people want other people with power dead. It was quite an even exchange too. Dead, usually, hero for a certain amount of money. The amount changed depending on the person he was going to kill and how soon they were wanted dead. Izuku gave himself a pat on the back as he thought of how the news hasn't even picked up on him yet. All they have is a bunch of dead, mostly heroes and theories. The news and police even started speculating it was Stain. And Izuku couldn't be happier for that, because the more they didn't think it was him, the longer he could stay out doing what he loved. But as fun as his new job was, it was also quite exhausting. From the planning and research that goes into learning and tracking his victims, sleep and eating just wasn't always a top priority. School never really mattered, and if he didn't feel like going or just wanted to take a day to sleep or work more, he would. Izuku looked down at the just-finished plan, then stared at the next name to be started on. Izuku checked the time, then, without much of a second thought, decided he was going to take a break for a little while. He closed all of his notebooks and laptop, then threw on his Vigilante outfit. By a break, he meant flying across rooftops in a mask that only covered half his face with the comfort of a hoodie on, and from time to time punching people in the face. Izuku was just barely 10 minutes out when he ran into a guy about to be mugged by this big, burly dude. Izuku ran in without much thinking, jumped off the wall, and punched the big guy square in the face. Unfortunately, it didn't do much and the guy only staggered back a bit. Izuku flexed his hand. He could have sworn he put everything into that, even had the momentum of kicking off the wall. The other dude, the one that was about to be mugged, ran behind the protection of Izuku. The big guy came stomping up to the Izuku and towered over him. Izuku, wanting to test a theory, did the same thing he did before and ran up the wall, kicked off and punched the guy in the nose. But again, the guy only staggered back. No bloody face, No broken nose, no bruise forming. Izuku had to admit this guy was rather large in size, and he may have some sort of mutation quirk or not to him, but that shouldn't mean Izuku's punch did absolutely nothing to him. Izuku looked down at his hand as he watched it flex into a fist, then open. He listened to the angry complaints of the guy he kept punching in the face as he approached. Izuku pulled out a knife from his belt and watched the big guy tumble to the ground after cutting his Achilles' heels. Big guy's knees hit the ground, and he couldn't catch himself before his chin hit the floor, and he knocked himself out. Izuku left a sticky note on the guy, and after being thanked by the other dude that was saved by him, he told him to call the police. Izuku was gone long before they showed up, though, and he was already back to the top of a building. Izuku flexed his hand into a fist and had to admit to himself that he was still weak. All this training and fights he had gone through built more of his skill rather than strength. His body was still physically weak, and he didn't really like the idea of that. It was something he needed to fix and work on as soon as possible. Thinking on how to work on it quickly, Izuku thought back on a certain beach he passes by every day and knew just what he could do. But until then, he was going to finish that break he wanted. Izuku took a running start and jumped to the next rooftop, then the next. He listened for any form of a fight and searched for anyone looking like they could last a while against him. He soared across the sky. Izuku didn't know if it was because he was slightly letting himself go so he could fully embrace the freedom of the air, or because the person covered in black was just that good at stealth. When he looked to his right, Izuku found Eraserhead in the air next to him. He immediately freaked out by the sudden undetected appearance of the hero and missed his footing as they both went to the land on the building in front. Oh shit, Izuku found himself saying he started to fall. Why was he always falling off buildings around this guy? Izuku tried to grab at the ledge, but couldn't. Just then a hand wrapped around his and pulled him up over the edge. He rolled over onto his back and caught his breath after the sudden shock and near-death experience. He looked up at the scowling face of Eraserhead and held his hands up in surrender. He nervously chuckled under the glare of Eraserhead as he said, "It wasn't intentional this time, I swear. You just startled me a bit." Izuku popped up onto his feet and stretched. "We've got to stop meeting like this, Eraser," Izuku said with a cheeky grin as he bent to his sides and stretched out his back. The grin wasn't seen, of course, because of the mask, but it stretched to his eyes and was definitely heard. Izuku looked up at Eraserhead, watching him rub at his temples as he mumbled the phrase, "I did not drink enough coffee today for this. I should have slept in just more. Hey, you got a new scarf." Izuku pulled on the cloth material before it was pulled away by Eraserhead. Eraserhead furrowed his eyebrows and gave Izuku a scowl as he wrapped the scarf back around his neck, burying his face. "Yeah, no thanks to you for cutting up my last one." Eraserhead let out a sigh as Izuku started to laugh to himself, remembering the event. A large bang was heard just then, and both turned in the direction of the sound and started running towards it. Looking over the edge of the building into the alley below, they both saw a woman being threatened with a gun by a guy with crazy curly hair that was moving. Eraserhead looked over at Izuku and was caught off guard by the quiet rambling escaping from his mouth. One of Izuku's hands was moving in the air, as if writing something, and his eyes looked like they were zoned out, but were still staring at the situation below. Eraserhead watched as he suddenly stopped, stood up, then jumped. Izuku hopped between the buildings, then rolled onto the ground, all to soften the blow of landing. Izuku had only one thought in his mind as he pulled out one of his knives from his tool belt and stared down at the man in front of him. All this time, and I've never fought someone with a gun before. This ought to be fun. The gun was pointed straight at Izuku, and the dude shouted at him, "Stop before I shoot." Much too late, though, because when the first shot rang out, Izuku was already right next to the guy, slicing a knife across his leg. Said guy dropped the gun to the ground and started screaming in agony as he grabbed at his leg. Just then, Eraserhead landed right next to him, but Izuku paid him no mind as he put his hand into a fist, pulled it back, and punched the guy holding his leg straight in the nose. The guy stumbled back and fell on his, but ultimately just looked at Izuku, pissed as blood ran down the front of his mouth, exiting from his nose. "Seriously," Izuku yelled. "I thought that would have been a knockout or something. A bloody nose, that's it. This was not as fun as I thought it would be." Izuku pouted as he stepped forward and started reeling back his arm again. Eraserhead had no clue what that last part was supposed to mean, but he stepped in before anything else happened and pulled Izuku back by his hood. "Kid, are you trying to get yourself killed?" "What the foo?" Izuku pulled away and started running towards the guy on the floor ready to punch him. Eraserhead pulled him back again, then just went ahead and restraining the guy on the floor with his scarf, rendering him even more useless than he already was. Eraserhead pointed to the girl that had run a little way down the alley and was sobbing her eyes out. "Go check on her while I take care of this guy." Izuku looked at the woman and was offended that he was stuck with cleanup. He never did this when it was just him. He certainly wasn't going to do it now. Izuku shook his head no. Eraserhead raised an eyebrow questioningly. "What do you mean no?" "Just go over there and check if she's injured." "She looks fine." Izuku flexed his hand into a fist. "Now I want to confirm something real quick." He stepped towards a guy sitting on the ground wrapped in Eraser's capture scarf. "Kid, no. You don't need to hit him anymore. Just go and make sure she's all right." Eraserhead couldn't believe he was dealing with this right now. How much did this kid want to punch this guy? Why did he want to punch this guy so bad? It wasn't doing much, and he was restrained. "Eraser, why don't you go check on her, and let me watch him?" Izuku stepped forward with his arms out, prepared to be handed over the scarf. Eraserhead pulled the scarf in his hands back and away from the hands reaching for it. "Nice try. He could still be dangerous." Come on, Eraser. His quirk is on the weaker and non-combatant side. He looks as if he doesn't even work out. From the way he looked holding the girl against the wall, this is his first, maybe second time doing this. And the only weapon he had he dropped. Ped. Izuku remembered the gun and looked to where it had fallen out of the guy's hand. Not seeing it there, he rushed at the guy with no hesitation, dodging the hand from Eraser, trying to grab him. The guy had managed to grab the gun lying on the floor while they were arguing. He pointed it towards Eraserhead's leg, but Izuku kicked it out of his hand before he could pull the trigger. Izuku grabbed at the guy's head and brought his knee up to meet the guy's face. This time, actually knocking the guy out. Eraserhead pulled him back, but the guy was now laying passed out on the ground. Izuku backed away, threw his hands, and walked away. "Okay, now I'll go check on her." Eraserhead watched him walk over to the girl, then turned back to the guy on the ground in front of him. This kid was being reckless with his life. Who just runs into a gunfight with only knives? But he had a question: how had this kid analyzed this guy from so far away and so quick as well? He had little to no information before jumping in to help the kid. But this kid knew what and who he was going against in that short amount of time. Quirk, maybe? Eraserhead heard someone start shuffling away. He could tell they were trying to quietly sneak away, but they just were not at a level yet to where Eraserhead couldn't detect them. "Hey, kid," Eraserhead called. No answer. "Kid," he called back again. Eraserhead looked behind him, but Izuku wasn't there. Instead, the woman was walking up to him with 2 sticky notes, and he saw someone turning the corner out of the alleyway. He had a feeling this wasn't going to be the last he saw of the kid. "He told me to give this to you," she said, handing him one of the notes. "Sorry had to go. Have some stuff to figure out, then work on." The note read, "He also said to put this on him," the woman said as she handed Eraserhead the other sticky note and pointed to the guy on the ground. "Bloody nose, scrawny, and serious case of needing the gym. Look at him, dude looks like a stick." The second note read, "So this was the Vigilante, leaving the sticky notes this whole time." Eraserhead thought as he crumpled up both of them and stuck them in his pocket. Eraserhead may or may not have even noticed him leaving. He did hear him calling for him, though. But he wasn't chased after, at least. Izuku had just walked away after leaving the sticky notes with that woman. Izuku wasn't kidding, though. What he had written on the sticky note was true. He looked down at his hand, clenching it and unclenching it. Izuku was weak in many ways. He thought he had built up some strength with all the training he's done, but apparently not, because he is still physically weak. Izuku stopped in front of his destination and looked down at his next big project. What better way to build up strength than to clear up a beach full of trash? Aizawa knocked on the door to Shinso's room before hearing the okay to enter. The kid no longer looked shocked to see him, being a respectful human being and parent in the making, and knocking before entering. Aizawa thought back to the many sit-downs he had with Shinso upon his first arrival. Aizawa knocked, but after a few seconds of no answer from the other side asked, "Can I come in?" There was a hesitant yes from the other side, but Aizawa didn't open the door just yet. Kid, if you don't want me to come in, you can just say so. There was a few seconds of silence before Aizawa heard light footsteps approach the door. Then it slowly creaked open. Shinso stood tall in the doorway, trying to look calm, but Aizawa noticed him gripping the hem of his shirt. I'm just checking on you. I don't need to come in. We don't need to talk for long if you don't want to. Shinso scrunched his face in confusion. Why? Aizawa raised an eyebrow. Why what? Why am I checking on you? Shinso shook his head slightly. Why'd you knock? Why didn't you just come in like everyone else? Aizawa frowned just a bit to this. Was the kid so foreign to what it was like to receive respect? To know privacy? He understood the whole villain quirk situation on a far too personal level, and when his mother abandoned him at the age of 10 after the death of his father, he knew what it was like to be tossed around in foster care. He understood most of what Shinso had gone through, but had the kid really not experienced any of this in any one of his homes? Kid, you may not be staying here for very long, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve to be respected and have your own privacy. It's your business for the most part what you do behind your closed door. Unless you're actively bleeding or dying, there's no reason for me to enter without your permission. Aizawa watched as Shinso slowly unclenched the hand on the bottom of his shirt. I was just here to check on you, and also wanted to ask if ramen was all right for dinner. A faint smile formed on Shinso's lips as he nodded. Aizawa recollected the one of many talks about how Shinso was a human being and deserved to be treated as such. As Shinso continued to stay longer and longer, Aizawa had to show and teach him what human decency was, because the kid had basically never really experienced it up until this point. Aizawa stepped into Shinso's now official room to find said kid hunched over on his bed doing homework. Shinso scratched his head in frustration as he looked down at the math worksheet he was working on. Shinso looked up at Aizawa, who was standing near the door, and relaxed his face. Math again, Aizawa said in his deep voice. Yeah, Shinso let out a long, frustrated sigh. It didn't look too difficult when she was going over it during class, but now that I'm home, Shinso let out another sigh and fell back onto his bed. You need help? Aizawa was already walking over and picking up the worksheet. Nah, you look like you're heading out, and I kind of want to try and figure it out myself. Aizawa was in his hero gear and was getting ready to leave earlier than usual, but that didn't mean he didn't mind staying to help. If you want to help, I can stay. Kid, it's okay if you need the help. You're not wasting my time at all. Aizawa looked at the first problem on the worksheet and then at the notes sitting on Shinso's bed. Shinso hesitated at the gesture of help, but still shook his head. Nah, I'm good. I can do this. I'll end up figuring it out eventually. Shinso sat up and picked up a pencil. Aizawa handed the worksheet back to Shinso before a thought occurred to him. Kid, just curious. I've been helping you out from time to time since you got here, but you seem to be decent with all the older units. Are you just struggling now with it because of the new living situation? Shinso shook his head. No, I've always struggled with math. It wasn't until this kid showed up at my last foster house. Aizawa watched as Shinso visibly lit up at the mention of this kid. He was the same age as me, but was on a whole new level when it came to school. He always looked so bored when it came to schoolwork. Not because it wasn't interesting to him, but because it was just too easy for him. So this kid would help you out? Shinso nodded. Aizawa paused for a second before it registered for him. You said in your last house. There wasn't any other kids or anyone else besides, when we were there. Shinso's shoulders dropped. Shinso spoke faint and quiet as a sad tone encompassed his words. He ran away about a month before I did. Oh, kid, I'm sorry. Aizawa frowned and carefully placed a hand on his shoulder. He seemed to have really liked this kid, Aizawa thought. Why couldn't this kid have anything good stick around in his life up until now? Don't be. I'm glad he did, Shinso said with a bit of a happier tone, although still looking quite gloomy. Aizawa was taken aback by this for a moment, but let him continue. I had a villain quirk. Aizawa cleared his throat. They had long since had the discussion of how his quirk wasn't that of a villain's. I had a quirk, my foster. Shinso waved his hand around trying to look for a word that wasn't parent before he landed on foster demons and continued. My foster demons were scared of me, and so most of the time they didn't hit me, just locked me in my room with my muzzle. But they did hit Izuku, this kid. Shinso paused for a long second. They hit and beat him for reasons that made no sense, but he also would stand up for me and they would really knock the shit out of him. Then Aizawa furrowed his eyebrow and gave Shinso's shoulder a light squeeze as he looked to get sadder the more he talked about this other kid. It was nice that Shinso was finally opening up, even if it was just him talking about someone else, but it still hurt to see Shinso hurt as he talked about this kid that he seemed to be once close with. He finally had had enough or something, because one morning I woke up and there was a note saying he was sorry and my muzzle was gone with him. Shinso wiped away the small tear that formed in his eye with the palm of his hand. Aizu, this kid, he was the strongest person I knew, and I didn't blame him for leaving, but sometimes, Shinso's voice broke as he tried not to cry. Sometimes I wish he had taken me with him. Aizawa pulled Shinso into a hug, holding him to his chest without squeezing too tight, while also holding loose enough so if Shinso wanted to escape the grasp he could. But Shinso didn't. His arms were wrapped around himself, as if the many years of giving himself a hug were ingrained in him. But he was leaning against the embrace of Aizawa. Thank you for telling me this. It means a lot to me. It did mean a lot to him for Shinso to be opening up like this. He released Shinso from the hug and looked at him seriously. Aizawa was already adding this kid Shinso talked about to his list of priorities and was determined to try and find him. Do you know what happened to him? My foster demons would tell me that he was dead and that he would never be able to survive more than a day out there because of his. Shinso paused for a second, and his face scrunched up as he tried to think of the right words. His quirk status? Shinso hesitated as if unsure of his own words, but only for a second. He gripped his hand into a fist and looked more awake than ever as his eyes filled with unwavering certainty. But I know he isn't. I know he's still alive and just out there somewhere. He's probably having the time of his life, no longer being trapped. A smile escaped from Aizawa's mouth. There was a chance this kid was dead, and Aizawa knew it in the back of his mind. But if Shinso thinks he's still alive, then he won't stop looking until proven otherwise. The question was just how to start. Shinso didn't seem like he was willing to give up the name of this kid just yet. He probably thought he was protecting him. But Aizawa could always go through Tsukauchi to get the information. Aizawa let Shinso return back to his work, saying his "see you later" as he started heading out. I'll be back around the same time as usual unless something comes up. If you get hungry, just heat up the leftovers if you want. Aizawa paused. Anything you need before I get going? Shinso looked down at his work and hesitantly shook his head. Aizawa walked towards the door, but was stopped right as he walked out. Shota, Shinso said in a quiet voice. Aizawa knew he was probably never going to be dad for him, but this was still a huge step up from when he was calling Eraserhead for the longest time. Aizawa's heart swelled, and he hid his huge smile and his capture weapon wrapped around his neck. Aizawa turned to face Shinso, who had a hand on the back of his neck and was looking down. Aizawa could tell he was nervous even though there was no need to be. Shinso looked up at Aizawa and nervously asked, "Can you do the first problem before you go?" Aizawa happily walked back over to the bed. "I certainly can," after doing it out. Explaining each step as he solved it, Aizawa left for the night feeling lighter than usual. Aizawa locked the front door to his home and then turned towards the street. He had a kid he was now searching for whenever he could. But tonight, he had a vigilante he needed to find and imbue knowledge into. Izuku was sitting on the ledge of a building playfully swinging his legs over the edge. He was quite sore from all the cleaning and moving of the trash from Dagoba Beach and was taking his well-deserved break while out patrolling in his vigilante gear. Maybe he was more tired than usual, because when he felt a tap on his shoulder and looked up to see Eraserhead looking down at him, nothing could stop him from getting startled and almost falling off the building. Izuku was shouting off profanities at the hero for sneaking up on him again, while the hero himself held onto Izuku's hood to keep him from going over the ledge. Izuku was flailing his arms and legs off the edge, and the hero's hold was the only thing keeping him from falling. Eraserhead was only holding Izuku with one hand and couldn't help but wonder, why was this kid so light? "Can you put me down now?" Izuku screeched as he tried to grab at Eraserhead's hand. Eraserhead lifted him up over the ledge like he was holding a cat by the back of its neck. Eraserhead held Izuku in the air as if he weighed nothing, hovering him over the flat surface of the building roof. Izuku flailed around some more before being suddenly dropped. After landing directly on his ass, Izuku stood up and gave Eraserhead a scowl as he rubbed at his tailbone. Eraserhead looked completely unaffected by such an action, almost seeming as if he was holding back laughter. "What the shit, Eraser? Why do you always have to be sneaking up on me like that? One of these days." "That's exactly why I came to find you," Eraserhead said in a raspy, deep voice, cutting Izuku off. "You're just not going to be able to catch me in time." Izuku paused as he registered what Eraserhead just said. He looked up at the scruffy underground hero, his eyes wide and an eyebrow raised questioningly. "Wait, what?" Eraserhead, trying to just ignore that last comment, explained himself further. "I have a feeling I'm not getting rid of you anytime soon, so I want to train or help improve your ability to be stealthy." Izuku perked up slightly to this, so Eraser continued. "From what I saw the other day, with a little more work you could be capable of getting yourself a license." Izuku almost seemed to flinch at the word license because he knew what it implied, and he already didn't want it. He no longer was interested now. He could teach himself stealth if he needed to improve more. But Eraserhead continued on with his speech. "You can legally be on the streets as a hero without the risk of being caught and arrested by another hero." Izuku was quiet, and he started to relax his face from what was once excitement at the idea of being taught by his favorite hero. He completely forgot about the risk of being caught as a vigilante. Probably because he's technically not being an illegal vigilante because of the no-quirk thing. He was more worried about being caught while he was out doing his villain stuff. Being caught as a vigilante never really crossed his mind. Izuku could tell that Eraserhead was a little confused by the reaction or lack thereof, coming from him as he stared up at him. "So, what do you say, kid, about?" No, Izuku had made up his mind long ago. He wasn't going to be a hero. What? This was not the answer Eraserhead was expecting. He thought he would get hesitation or uncontrollable excitement at the idea. Maybe even an "I don't know." Izuku shrugged his shoulders. "I don't want to be a hero. So no. And if getting personally trained by you means I have to be a hero, then I don't want it," Izuku said, impassiveness seeping through his words. Eraser was dumbfounded by this answer. Why be a vigilante if not the desire to be a hero? Vigilantes, most of the time, are just illegal heroes. A hero without the license. They want to help people, but denied the chance. Yet this kid sounded emotionless to the idea, like he was used to saying no. Why? Eraserhead couldn't help but find himself saying, "I just don't want to be a hero." Izuku was emotionless with his answer. There was no other reason besides the lack of desire. He was tired of heroes, tired of what he could and couldn't do, or should and shouldn't do. Eraserhead's eyes continued to stare at him, as if waiting for a different answer. "What? I just don't want to." Izuku started walking away and to the ledge with the fire escape. He was about to step onto it when he was pulled back by a scarf and was right back in front of Eraserhead. Now he was starting to get irritated. Izuku looked up at the hero and started raising his voice. "What is so hard to understand?" "Okay," Eraserhead said with a calm and collected tone. "Okay, what?" Izuku said, still irritated. "You don't want to be a hero." "Okay. I still want to train you, though. You're far too loud and reckless, and that could get you possibly killed." "Why?" Izuku had started to settle down, but now was confused as all hell. "Why still choose to train me?" Eraserhead shrugged. "Just felt like it." "Ah, yes, I see," Izuku said in a sarcastic tone. Of course, because the hero felt like it. Izuku couldn't tell if he was being pitted or if Eraserhead just genuinely wanted to train him in the art of stealth. Yes, now, Eraserhead clapped his hands together. Lesson 1. Lighten your footsteps. Izuku didn't know what the answer was, but he had a feeling he was about to find out. Bakugo was tired, and that was probably why he just tried to ignore instead of yell at the idiots that were sitting around him, going on about this new vigilante that had surfaced and was gaining a lot of news coverage lately. He was called something like Nightwalker of Emeralds or something stupid like that. This vigilante had been the talk of the school ever since a few days ago when a video of him beating up someone twice his size went around and the question of his quirk was suddenly asked. As everyone saw the pictures and videos that were, of course, secretly taken of the vigilante, it was realized that no one knew what quirk the Nightwalker had. The idiots were standing around his desk as they discussed what they thought the mysterious quirk was. Bakugo had his head resting on his hand as he stared out the window in his normal brooding manner. They would show him pictures of the Vigilante asking him what he thought the quirk might be, but Bakugo would just ignore them or smack the phone out the way. He knew as much as everyone else on this matter and could only narrow it down but never figure it out. This Vigilante extra didn't have any major mutation quirk because he was relatively small and didn't have anything bulging or coming out of the suit he wore, wings, tail, horns, etc. However, half of his face and all of his body were covered up so something could be easily hidden, like sharp teeth or a glowing nose. Nightwalker or whatever doesn't have anything like super speed or super strength. He could have something that has to do with the mind or could control accuracy. This stupid Vigilante extra doesn't have anything obvious, though, that gives away what his quirk may be. He only uses knives, and even then he could have any of the above and just chooses not to use his quirk, which would be kind of a stupid idea. Another one of the idiots, Stretchy Eyes, walked in and straight over to the group surrounding Bakugo. Strutting up to the kid with longest fingers, Stretchy Eyes playfully slapped his shoulder as he asked him for a bit of help. Bakugo couldn't really catch what it was, but Fingers laughed and walked over to the door as the bell rang and the teacher walked in. Stretchy Eyes handed a chalkboard eraser to Fingers, and his long fingers stretched out and slowly placed it between the top of the sliding doors. "Boys, what are you doing? Everyone's already here. Who's it for?" The teacher at the front of the classroom asked the boys who were setting up the prank. "Not everyone, Sensei." Stretchy Eyes pointed to the only empty desk in the room. "Saw Deku walking to school this morning." Everyone looked at the empty desk in the back of the room and started snickering as they looked back at the two boys who were admiring their work. Everyone except Bakugo, who just stared out the window. Bakugo had stopped questioning and worrying about Deku not coming to school when he finally realized Deku just doesn't show up to school on a regular basis anymore. He just shows up when he wants. Admittedly, it wasn't like this in the beginning, while everyone in the class and even the whole school didn't care when Deku just didn't come to school. Bakugo was stuck worrying and being consumed by guilt. From the occasional restless nights to constantly checking the news, Bakugo didn't know what was happening to himself. He just wanted Deku to give up on this useless dream of his before he went and got himself and everyone around him killed. He didn't actually want him to go out and die, though. What had he done? Although still consumed by guilt at every waking moment of the day, he eventually started worrying less and less as time went on, and he realized Deku just didn't care about coming to school as he did before. Deku would show up one day, be absent the next, but in school the day after. There were times when he would be gone a few days at a time, but never too long. That wasn't until he disappeared for a couple of weeks. The first few days were fine, but then he wasn't showing up the days after that. All Bakugo could think as he laid awake at night, and well into the morning, was that Deku had actually died this time. However, nothing changed at school. No one even batted an eye whenever he was gone. No one. Absolutely no one. Deku had no friends as far as he knew, no family, no one he hangs out with at school, no one. All because of him. Bakugo had ruined his life and isolated him. He could have been dead, and no one would have mourned his passing. No one would have even realized he was dead. His death going completely unnoticed by everyone, all because of him. How had things gotten this bad? Suddenly, someone shushed the entire class as a kid in a quiet voice said, "I see Deku coming down the hall." The class quickly shut up except for the quiet snickering and whispering. Everyone looked at the door, including Bakugo, and waited for the inevitable explosion of chalk dust from the eraser hitting the head of its intended victim. But no one picked up on the fact that it felt like hours were going by just waiting for Deku to walk in because it was completely silent outside that door. No one noticed besides Bakugo. There was no sound coming from the hallway. No footsteps could be heard walking down the hall to the class. Bakugo didn't even know if Deku was coming, even if someone had said they saw him. Everyone watched as if it was in slow motion as Deku's hand reached around the door, and he pushed it open and stepped through. The prank commenced, and as the chalkboard eraser fell from where it was secured between the wall and the door, Bakugo felt a chill run down his spine. Deku was staring right at him with a small smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. The eraser hit Deku's head, and chalk dust filled the air. The class burst out in laughter, and Deku looked around and at the chalkboard eraser now lying on the ground, as if surprised by it. Deku held out his arms, shocked, as the chalk dust fell into his hands like falling snow. Bakugo rubbed his eyes in confusion. Did he really just see that? The teacher clapped his hands together and yelled at Deku to stop messing around and to get into his seat already. The class continued to laugh as Deku morosely walked to the back of the room and sat down in his chair. Bakugo looked back at Deku to see if it was just his imagination, but Deku's head was down as he was shaking his head and running his hands through his hair trying to get the chalk dust out. Bakugo stared at him when suddenly Deku's eyes flicked up and met his. Bakugo quickly looked forward at the front of the class and didn't look back even after the bell rang. Izuku pushed a tire through the sand and up onto the street. He rolled it into a pile of other tires from the beach. Next to that pile was another pile, this one filled with broken home appliances. More piles of scrap metal and other useless junk stretched down the street. There were bags filled with trash scattered all over the beach and around the piles of junk. Izuku wiped the sweat off his face with his shirt and walked down the beach to pick up the next item. Approaching the giant heap of waste that stretched down the length of the beach, he picked up an old broken microwave. Walking it over to its designated pile, Izuku blew the hair out his face as he tried to keep it from going in his eyes the more the wind started to pick up. Eraserhead had told him to get it cut because it kept getting in his eyes during their training sessions. Izuku had thought it was ironic coming from him, especially since his hair is one of the biggest factors of when he activates his quirk. Izuku didn't dwell much on his hair and whether to get it cut or not. It got in the way sometimes, but growing it out gave him this sense of freedom. Dropping the microwave, Izuku pushed his hair back and out of his face. Hoping the accumulated sweat would help in slicking it back, he continued with his work, but stopped before he got very far. A faint feeling washed over him, like someone was watching him. He didn't know from where or how far. Izuku couldn't even completely tell if someone was even watching him, but there was a feeling running down his back. He shrugged it off and tried to ignore it as he continued on with his work. As his hair kept falling into his face, Izuku walked back up the pile searching. Spotting it in a pile, he picked up a blue shoelace and brought it over to a clean section of the beach. His sore muscles aching as he slowly tried to sit down in the sand. He looked around and behind him for anyone before relaxing of any kind. Izuku pulled back his hair on the top of his head and began wrapping the shoelace around his hair, trying to tie it back. But when he let his hair go, the shoelace loosened until it eventually fell to the ground and hair fell into his face. Izuku, picking up the shoelace, flung it around, trying to shake some sand off. He put it in his lap, grabbed another big handful of hair, then trying again, he tied the shoelace around the hair. This time it worked, and he now had a tiny ponytail of hair sitting on top of his head. Izuku stared at the setting sun for a bit before putting his hands behind his head and laying back in the sand. Looking up at the sky, he watched the clouds go by, chuckling at the ones that resembled other things. He saw a fluffy white go by in the form of ducks, boats, and dragons. When a mushroom-shaped cloud flew by, Izuku couldn't help but be reminded of explosions and Bakugo, and how Bakugo was no longer acting the same. Bakugo seemed to be getting used to his absences and didn't react like he used to when Izuku would be gone. He no longer looked relieved to see him. Izuku could still see the guilt radiating off of him, and they still basically ignored each other, but Bakugo was getting too used to everything. Izuku had spiced it up a little the other day during the chalkboard eraser prank, but that wasn't enough. He needed to think of something he could do, something that could make Bakugo unrecoverable. And Izuku might just know what that is. Izuku sat up and slowly got up, all the while his sore muscle pleaded for him to lay back down. Walking over to the pile of trash covering the beach, he felt up his arms trying to feel out how much slash, if any, muscle had been gained in these last few days. But nothing was there and was still twig-like as ever. He knew results weren't going to be instant, but a boy can dream. Izuku approached the garbage pile, picked up some scrap metal, and walked it over to the designated pile. Dropping the trash, the feeling came back stronger than ever, and this time he was certain someone was watching him. He grabbed a rusty kitchen knife from one of the piles and gripped it tight at his side. He found a metal pipe and held it in his other hand. He looked out into the buildings and streets, trying to pinpoint where they were, but couldn't find them. Izuku started to pace as he looked harder, but still couldn't find them. Starting to get irritated, Izuku yelled, "Come out!" A few seconds of silence, but no one stepped forward. Izuku yelled out again, "I know you're out there. Come out." After another few grueling seconds of silence, someone emerged from the shadows of a building. A tall man wearing black ripped jeans with what appeared to have something strapped to the back of his legs, a black hoodie, and a red scarf wrapped around his neck walked towards Izuku. The scarf waved around in the small amount of wind that blew in the air as the man got closer to Izuku. With the man now 10 feet in front of him, Izuku raised his weapons. The man grabbed for the handle of his katana strapped to his back, but never pulled it out. "Whoa, kid. Why on the defense so quick? I told you I'd be back," the man said in a deep, gruff voice. "I told you I'd be back." Izuku twirled the pipe in his hands. "I know. I just wasn't expecting to be visited this soon, Stain." Izuku threw the pipe and rusty knife back into the pile they came from, staring at Stain as he did it. Stain, although confused at first, couldn't help but be intrigued by Izuku. He knew the kid was interesting already, but to forego his weapons as if they were useless to him. Stain began to unsheath his katana, but before completely taking it out asked, "I could kill you right where you stand, so why throw away your weapons? Do you believe that you have gotten stronger than me since the last time we met, or is it that you believe too much in your quirk?" Izuku just smiled and looked as if he didn't have a care in the world. "If you wanted to kill me, you would have done it already." "Not entirely true, kid," Stain said as he unsheathed the rest of his sword and lunged towards Izuku. Izuku dodged out of the way and dove at Stain's legs. He grabbed the weapon that was strapped to the back of Stain's leg and rolled away and onto his feet. Izuku pointed the army knife at Stain. Izuku looked focused and as if he could cut someone with his glare alone. "Although I would like to think I've gotten stronger than you since the last meeting, I know I haven't. Especially when I take into account how much you held back." Stain lunged at Izuku as he swung his katana. "Let's see how much you've improved since I've been away." Izuku dodged out of the way of the katana and thrust the knife upwards, aiming for Stain's arm. Stain brought a fist down with his other hand onto Izuku's arm, making Izuku drop the knife. Before it could reach the sand, Izuku caught it with his other hand and aimed it towards Stain's neck. Stain kicked Izuku's knee, causing Izuku to lose his balance and fall to the ground just as he felt the knife graze his cheek. Stain brought his katana down onto Izuku's back, slicing the side of his abdomen before Izuku could completely roll away. Izuku lunged forward to get behind Stain, then rolled onto his back. Izuku blocked the oncoming blade with 2 army knives. Stain looked down at his leg for a split second to see that the knife strapped to his other leg was missing now as well. He looked back up at Izuku, quite impressed. Stain let out a low chuckle. "Nice try, kid, but the battle was over the minute you got hit with my blade." Stain jumped back and brought the blade to his mouth. "Not entirely true," Stain heard the kid say as he watched a knife fly right past him. "Kid, you're going to have to try harder than that." Stain looked back at Izuku, now running toward him with the other knife. But Izuku didn't get very far as Stain watched him drop to the ground as he licked the blood clean off his sword. Izuku, laying flat on his stomach, looked up at Stain, who was now walking towards him. Stain reached down and grabbed the knife from his loose, paralyzed fingers and put it back into one of the straps on the back of his leg. He then walked away to retrieve the other knife that Izuku had thrown at him. Stain put the knife in the other strap on his leg and walked back over to Izuku. Stain began circling Izuku as he looked around the beach. "So, what do you have going on here?" Izuku remained silent, honestly not even sure if he could speak. Stain nudged Izuku with his foot. "Your body may be paralyzed, but your mouth isn't. What's the deal with the beach?" "I'm cleaning it," Izuku said, sounding bored. Izuku felt the twitch of his fingers as he tried to move them. "No duh. I'm asking why." Stain witnessed the fingers move as well and took it upon himself to position himself on him. Izuku tried to move the rest of his arm as he felt the crushing weight of Stain sitting on his back. "Typo, huh? Doesn't matter though, can't have you getting up yet. I still have more questions. So why clean the beach?" Izuku tried to sigh, but with the weight on his back, he couldn't inhale enough air to even breathe. "I'm trying to build more muscle." A low, gruff laugh started to escape from Stain as he poked at Izuku's arms. "You're going to have to try harder than that, kid. It looks like you have sticks for arms." Izuku squirmed just a little under Stain as he yelled over Stain's laugh. "Shut up. I've only been doing it for a few days." Stain squeezed Izuku's arms as he continued to laugh. I feel like if I'm not careful enough, I'll break them by accident. Izuku tried to pull his arm out of Stain's grasp, but it was of no use. As he began to wiggle and squirm, the more the paralysis wore off, the more Stain pinned Izuku down. Stain's laughter slowly faded, and Izuku started going still. Like I said, I have questions. Can you at least get off me first? Izuku wiggled under Stain. You're going to crush me before you even get an answer to any of your questions. Stain reluctantly got off of Izuku, but not before sliding a finger along the wound on Izuku's abdomen and licking the blood off his fingers. Izuku literally felt the weight being lifted off of him as Stain stood up and sat in the sand in front of Izuku. Though paralyzed once again, Izuku took a deep breath in and inhaled as much air as he could, trying to breathe in all the air he missed while Stain was crushing him. Looking at Stain in front of him, Izuku couldn't help his face from appearing irritated and bored, but was just overall done. What did you want to ask me? Izuku said, already sounding like he wanted to leave. He would try if he could. You still have the knife I gave you? Stain said while playing with one of the knives he had strapped to the back of his legs. Yeah, what about it? Izuku said, bored. Oh, I'm surprised you still have it. Stain didn't look surprised or shocked in the slightest. I'm not going to throw away a pretty useful gift. Or was it a reminder? Izuku tried to shrug his shoulders, but they didn't move. Both. A gift for the new Vigilante that had caught my interest, and a reminder to the new Vigilante that I'd be back for him. Izuku stared at Stain with a tired expression. I'm going to be honest with you, buddy. I totally forgot you existed until you showed up today. Izuku let out a yawn. Can you get to the point already? You're boring me so much you're putting me to sleep. This is why I came back to train you. Stain grinned. You could easily die at any second by my hands, especially now more than ever with my quirk active, and yet instead of scared, you're bored. Didn't we literally just go over how you couldn't kill me that easily? Did that whole fight we just get erased from your brain or something? And hold up, go back to that whole training me thing. What was? Not the point, Stain said, cutting off Izuku. What is the point was that I have returned, because I want to make you my successor. Izuku audibly coughed as if he was choking on something. Can you repeat yourself? I'm not sure if I heard you correctly. You heard right. I wish to train you and make you my successor. Izuku, still shocked by what he's hearing and not entirely sure if it's true, asks. And if I refuse? Stain simply shrugged his shoulders. It's your decision. I'm not here to force you to become my successor. Stain pushed the knife in his hands gently into the sand. He tried to see how far he could push it down with just one finger. I still wish to train you and show you my ways. It wouldn't be wise to refuse that. As Izuku thought about it, he felt the paralysis wearing off, but instead of trying to run, he just sat up. He crossed his legs and rested his hands on his legs. Looking at Stain, he asked, so let me get this straight. Whether I choose to be your successor or not, you're still going to train me to become your successor. Stain didn't move even after seeing Izuku sit up. When you put it like that, then yes, you may refuse the training. Although I doubt you will. Izuku looked at him questioningly. And why do you say that? Stain waved his finger around in a circle. You have a desire to improve. It's evident by the fact that you're cleaning the beach for your own benefit. So by receiving training from me, you would ultimately improve a great deal in many aspects. Stain stared at Izuku with an unmoving gaze. You wouldn't turn down such an offer, would you? Izuku rested his head on one of his hands. No, I wouldn't. Izuku stared back at Stain, also with an unmoving gaze. But I don't wish to become your successor. Stain nodded his head. If that is your choice, that's fine, but I would like you to wait until the end of your training before you fully make a decision. Izuku lifted his head from his hand and interlaced his fingers in his lap. He nodded. That's fair, but are you actually going to respect my choice if I still say no at the end? Stain nodded. It's your choice. There's no point in me forcing you to be my successor. At that point, you would be more of an accomplice than a successor. So you'll really respect my decision? Stain gave a firm nod. Yes. Izuku looked at him questionably. Why wouldn't I? What do you take me for? Our first meeting, I watched you kill a semi-well-known man in cold blood without hesitation. Why respect what I choose? Stain gave a big sigh and looked at Izuku, tired. Look, kid, I don't know why this is such a big deal to you, but I promise when this is all said and done, if you choose not to follow in my footsteps, that's that. We say our goodbyes? Izuku raised his eyebrow as he looked at Stain with a questioning stare. I'm a serial killer, not a monster. You want me to pinky swear on it or something? Izuku looked at Stain with a small smile and began to laugh a little. Stain gave a very faint smile in return. Okay, I get it, you'll respect and understand my decision. Now, when do we start this whole training thing? How does tomorrow sound? Izuku hissed in a breath. I can't do tomorrow. I need to do something first. What about a few days from now? Stain began resurrecting the knife he had buried in the sand. Do you attend school? Stain pondered this for a second. School may get in the way of me training you. Izuku shook his head. No, it'll be fine. It won't be much of a problem in a few days. If you say so. Stain got up and put the knife back into one of the straps on the back of his leg. Izuku also got up, raising his arms into the sky as he stretched his body. Just come find me here when I'm done. And when will that be? You'll know when. Izuku paused for a second in thought and started mumbling about the news and how they might not air it. You may not find out about it, actually, so, I don't know, just meet here a week from now. Stain looked at Izuku confused before he just shrugged his shoulders and left. Izuku hurried home from the beach and pulled out a notebook immediately after closing the big doors. Better to start sooner rather than later, especially since he had a death to plan. Going home, after killing his intended target, Izuku didn't think that helping a random stranger with a giant scar going down his forehead find his mask one night was going to be very helpful to him in the long run. But how so very wrong he turned out to be. While meeting Jean, also known as Twice, was merely a coincidence in Izuku's life, the amount of use he could become to Izuku won't be led much by chance. For example, when Izuku one day showed up at Twice's apartment unannounced wearing black slacks, a white button-down, his smile mask, and a dark gray flat-cap, Jean did nothing but comply with his demands. Izuku was in the midst of planning something big, and in order for it to succeed, he had to make sure it worked first. Izuku knocked on Twice's door, and when the man slowly cracked the door open, Izuku didn't say anything and just waved. Twice, however, swung the door all the way open at the realization of who it was and yelled, "It's you." "Who are you?" Twice stepped aside and gestured for Izuku to come in. Once inside, Twice asked, "What can I do for you?" "Go away." Izuku pulled out a picture of himself, minus the mask. "I need you to make a clone of this kid," Izuku said with a low-sounding voice from the mask. Twice took a step back. "How did you find out about my quirk?" "Of course. When we met last and I was helping you find your mask, you kept muttering about whether you were the real one or not. I had read some articles a while back about how those with cloning quirks often go insane thinking they're just a clone." Izuku looked up at Twice. "It wasn't hard to put the pieces together and deduce you have a cloning quirk. Just like how I deduced that you wear the mask, because it makes you feel whole." Izuku held out the picture of himself again. "I need a clone made of him." Twice took the picture and studied it. He then handed it back to Izuku and shook his head. "I can't." One clone coming right up. Izuku, now leaning against the table behind him with his arms crossed, just stared at Twice, without moving or saying anything. Twice looked down at the ground, afraid to make eye contact. I need exact measurements." Izuku perked up. "Oh, good thing I prepared in advance then." The low voice from Izuku's mask raised in pitch from his sudden excitement. Izuku looked down so as not to reveal his hair when he lifted the front of his hat and pulled out a pen. He placed the picture upside down on the table behind him and clicked the pen. "What are the measurements you need?" The eyes of Twice went wide as joy filled him. He walked over to Izuku, glad he could be of assistance, especially since he wanted to repay the favor he owed him after finding his mask. Twice started spouting off the specific measurements he needed: height, arm span, nose, width of eyes, etc. And Izuku wrote down what he remembered from when he had measured himself last night. Izuku handed the picture back to Twice now, with the measurements written on the back. "What about now? Can you make me that clone?" Twice nodded eagerly. Twice stepped back, looked at the picture and measurements, then up at Izuku one last time before spreading his arms. The clone started emerging from the front of Twice, almost seeming to walk out of his body. Twice stepped aside from the now fully constructed clone of Izuku. The clone looked around before looking at the real Izuku. The clone then unbuttoned his school uniform, but didn't take off the shirt. Oh, you catch on quick. Izuku bent down and pulled a knife from his boot. The clone looked at Izuku a bit offended. I should hope so. I know I'm not the real one, especially since... The clone looked over to Twice, then back at Izuku. You know, the real Izuku gave a nod before the clone spoke again. So we doing this or what? The clone patted his chest. Izuku walked over and held a knife to the clone's chest. Wait, keep going. You'll destroy the clone if you do that. You'll be fine. Noted, Izuku said, looking at Twice as he stuck the knife all the way in and dragged it down. Izuku pulled the knife out, then stepped back and watched as the clone started falling apart and turning into a mud-like substance. Izuku squatted, poking with the end of his knife at the mud and goo the clone had become. Izuku clicked his tongue. That won't do. Izuku pointed at Twice with his knife. Follow me. Twice did as such, eager to help in whatever way he could. Standing on the roof of the building, Izuku peered over the railing and down at the ground below. Izuku, with his hands on his waist, nodded to himself. I can work with that. Izuku walked over to the door of the roof and gestured back to Twice when he didn't follow at first. I need to go get some stuff. Have 2 clones ready and made by the time I get back. Arriving back at Twice's door, Izuku peered back at Twice, who was twiddling with his fingers and looking overall nervous. The clones could attack each other. They'll have a tea party together. Izuku looked up at the nervous grown man. He shook his head and gently patted Twice's arm. They won't. I promise. Izuku said in the best comforting voice he could. Twice seemed to feel at ease with that, because right after he saluted Izuku and said, 2 more coming right up, Captain. Izuku grinned underneath his mask. If all it takes is a few encouraging words to gain Twice as an ally, then Izuku will say all the words he needed to. Izuku ran to a hardware store to pick up paint, and then got some syringes on the way back. Izuku walked into Twice's apartment to find Twice balled up in a corner staring at the 2 clones of Izuku who were sitting in the middle of the room, muttering quietly to each other. Randomly, they would laugh together about something and then return to muttering. Izuku walked over and placed a bag on the table. He then walked over to Twice in the corner. He lit up when he realized Izuku had returned and then pointed at the clones in the center of the room. They've been doing that since they've been created. Izuku looked over to the clones who were still muttering and randomly laughing. Izuku looked back at Twice and patted his shoulder before helping him up. See, told you they wouldn't attack each other. Twice, still not fully convinced, made sure to stand with Izuku in the middle of him and the clones as they walked over to the table. Izuku pulled out 2 tubs of red paint, one being darker than the other. He then reached in and pulled out a syringe, but immediately walked over to the sink and began vigorously scrubbing it. Where'd you get that? Sherlock, where's Dr. Watson? Twice asked, leaning against the counter next to him. Stole it from the first person I saw with a drug addiction on my way back from the hardware store. It didn't take me long to come across one, Izuku said casually while drying the inside of the syringe with a paper towel. He placed the now clean syringe next to the paints and walked over to the clones. He clapped his hands and nudged one with his boot, knocking them out of whatever muttering trance they were in together. Come on, people, we got work to do. The clones got up and followed Izuku to the roof with the supplies, Twice making sure to stay many feet back. Izuku stood in front of both clones. Rock, paper, scissor each other. The clones shrugged and faced each other, but even after several rounds, there was no winner due to them continuously tying. Izuku sighed. Stop, this isn't working. Izuku reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin. He pointed to the clone on the right. You're the side with the number. Izuku flipped the coin, caught it in his palm, then slapped it on the back of his hand. Izuku slowly lifted his hand. Ah, guess you're jumping first? Izuku said, pointing to the clone on the left. Both clones walked over to the edge. One clone got on the other side of the railing. Facing Izuku and holding onto the rail, the clone stared at Izuku, waiting for him to tell him when, but Izuku just reached forward and pushed the clone. The clone spread out his arms and closed his eyes until splat. Izuku looked at the once body slowly turning to mud below and nodded. That should work. Now, Izuku turned to the other clone. Hold out a wrist. As instructed, the clone lifted an arm and pulled up the sleeve of his school uniform. Izuku held the clone's wrist, feeling for a pulse, to which he was surprised to find one. Izuku took out a squash ball and handed it to him. He then told the clone to place it in his armpit. Once the ball was in place, Izuku felt for a pulse again, only to find the clone now missing one. Izuku took back the ball and brought the paints and syringe over. Filling up the syringe half dark red and half the lighter red, Izuku injected it into the clone. He did this until he felt there was enough fake blood circling the fake body. They went back over to the edge of the roof. The clone got on the other side of the railing and jumped. But instead of the body dissipating into brown mud, it was now dissolving into a thick red ooze. Izuku grinned a wide smile. Under his mask, his plan was going to be perfect. Izuku planned everything as perfectly as he could get. Only 2 clones were being used. One clone was filled with a mixture of red and dark red. The back of the other clone was also covered in red paint and was holding a squash ball in his pocket. The clone filled with paint was standing on top of the roof, and the clone covered in paint was hiding, waiting for the other clone to fall. Izuku sent a text, and the plan commenced. Bakugo wasn't paying attention in class. Deku was out again, but it felt different this time. When he had come to school yesterday, it had felt different as well. Bakugo tried focusing on whatever the teacher was saying, but honestly couldn't care. Just then he felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. He pulled it out to find he had gotten text from a random number. The text read, "Hurry, look out the window, before you miss it." Bakugo tiredly looked over to the window, just as he saw the familiar figure of Deku fall past him. "Deku!" Bakugo yelled as he hurriedly got up and ran to the window, his chair clattering to the ground behind him. Looking down, he saw a body covered in red. "Bakugo, what are you doing?" He heard the teacher say, but he couldn't be bothered by him right now. Bakugo rushed out the door of the class, and as he ran through the halls, he called for an ambulance to get here, and quickly, then just hung up. He ran all the way to the front of the school as fast as his legs could take him, even using his quirk a little just to get there faster. Bakugo burst out the front doors of the school, looking in both directions until seeing the puddle of blood and the familiar body lying in it. Bakugo raced over to Deku. Sliding up next to him, Bakugo looked down at the lifeless body of Deku staring up at the sky with a genuine smile on his face. No, 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 no. Bakugo grabbed handfuls of Deku's uniform as he laid his face down on his chest. What had he done to Deku? To Izuku? He didn't deserve any of it. Please, please don't. Just wake up, please. Bakugo pleaded with his head buried in Izuku's chest. Someone help! Bakugo yelled, his voice breaking. Please just... I still need to make up for all the shit I've done to you. Someone... Bakugo began to tear up and cry out, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. Please just wake up. Please. An ambulance drove around the corner and up to the scene. 2 guys hopped out the back and over to the body. At this point, there was a crowd of students pouring out of the building and looking from the windows. One of the EMTs was picking up Izuku's wrist. Shaking his head, he called for the other to bring it out. As such, the other EMT brought out a stretcher with a body bag already open sitting on it. The EMT tapped Bakugo's shoulder. Kid, he's dead. No, he can't be. I need. Bakugo lifted his head and looked at the EMT kneeling in front of him. He had dark black hair and scars covering his face and what was shown of his body. The stretcher was rolled next to the body, and both EMTs lifted it onto the stretcher, into the body bag, and they zipped the bag up. Bakugo sat next to the pool of blood as he watched them roll Izuku away. Tears uncontrollably fell down his face. He couldn't help but repeat, I'm sorry, over and over again. Bakugo watched as Izuku was placed in the back of the ambulance, and it drove away, leaving him to now just stare at the empty front gates of the school. Bakugo slowly rose to his feet and just stumbled his way home, not even bothering to acknowledge all the stares he got from those at school or anyone he passed on the street. How's he doing? Izuku yelled over the sirens from the driver's seat of the ambulance. Dabi unzipped the body bag and pulled the squash ball from the armpit of the dissolving clone. The ambulance swerved around cars, almost hitting them in the process as it barely stayed in a lane or even on the right side of the road for that matter. Dabi gripped the seat to keep himself from flying out of it as he yelled up to Izuku, Are you sure you can drive? Izuku yelled back, I can't hear you, but if you're talking about my driving, it's pretty easy now that I've got the hang of it. Izuku said, almost hitting more cars, but somehow managed to swerve around them in time. Twice sat next to Dabi, looking at the body slowly turning to mud. "He's gone, Captain." "Walk the plank," Twice yelled up to Izuku. Izuku turned the sirens off after feeling they were far enough from the school. "What were you saying?" Izuku asked, the deep voice from his mask sounding quiet. "It's dead. Already turning to shit," Dabi said while pulling out a cigarette from one of his pockets. Dabi lit a small flame on his index finger and brought it to the cigarette. "Almost didn't make it." Izuku pulled the ambulance over on a random sidewalk with no one around. He hopped out of the driver's seat and opened the back doors. Gesturing for the men to get out, they got up and stepped out. Izuku turned to Dabi. "I appreciate the help, especially on such short notice." Dabi chuckled as he blew smoke. "You did show up a little out of the blue, but it's the least I could do. You did kind of save my life last time we met." Izuku dismissed the men, and as they walked away, Dabi gave a playful two-finger salute after seeing Twice give a genuine salute to Izuku. Izuku couldn't help chuckling a bit on his walk back home. Another quirkless kid kills himself after jumping from the top of his school building. The news anchor paused for only a split second, then a smile grew across her face. Now on to the new up-and-coming heroes that will be graduating from UA this year. Izuku didn't know whether to be glad or irritated that this was the only news coverage of his death. No articles and no pictures, which was good. Nothing but this one sentence. Izuku knew he was quirkless, but damn, at least sound like his death was tragic. A funeral was held a few days later. A headstone was placed right next to his mother's. There was no body, though, because it had apparently gone missing. Izuku has no idea how that possibly could have happened. He stood behind the trees that surrounded the cemetery as he watched the Bakugo family and a few people that were friends with his mother stand around his grave. He, of course, was wearing his mask, flat cap, and an all-black suit. Bakugo was still there even after the sun had set, just sitting in front of his gravestone. Due to it being dark and Izuku practically unrecognizable, Izuku walked up to him. He kneeled down in front of his mother's gravestone, and technically Shinso's as well, placing a hand on both. Izuku got up and stood right next to Bakugo, who seemed not to have even noticed him yet. Bakugo was staring at the gravestone, zoned out, just muttering apologies. "You must be happy the quirkless loser is finally gone," Izuku said, staring at his own gravestone. It was sort of a trip to see his own name engraved on the stone piece in front. "No," Bakugo absent-mindedly said, coming back to reality. "He didn't deserve any of what he got, and it's all my fault." Bakugo angrily looked at the dead eyes of Izuku's mask. Izuku's hands were in his pant pockets, and he was staring down at Bakugo. "Whoever the F you are, you either pay your respects or get the F out of here." Izuku playfully put his hands up in surrender. Okay. I'm leaving." Izuku turned around to leave, but didn't start walking yet. Without turning around, he just said, "Yes, it was your fault. Just not all of it." The last of it came out quieter than the rest. Izuku walked away from a wide-eyed Bakugo, who promptly turned around crying to himself and vomiting out apologies to the headstone. The week had passed, so Izuku was sitting on the beach waiting. He heard the footsteps approach him from behind. Leaning back on his hands, he dipped his head back to see Stain standing behind him. Stain, looking down at him, asked, "So what did you end up doing, kid?" "Fake my own death," Izuku casually said with a smile on his face. Stain, surprised by the response, but genuinely interested, took a seat next to Izuku on the sand. "How'd that end up happening?" Izuku looked over at Stain. "I want to say it's a long story, but considering my one sentence of news coverage about it, apparently it's a lot shorter than I thought." Izuku flopped onto his back. He still proceeded to tell Stain all about it and all the planning behind it, only leaving out the people involved and the fact that he's literally a part-time hero killer himself. As the end of the story neared, Stain pulled out a knife and thrust it at Izuku's face, causing him to dodge and jump up onto his feet. This started the first day of training. Izuku jolted awake upon hitting the ground after getting roughly pulled out of his bed. Rubbing the sleep out of his eyes, he looked up at the figure standing over him. His father, dressed in casual clothes compared to the usual button-downs he would wear to work, was staring down at him, excitement covering his face. "Come on, Izuku. Get up. Your mom got called into work, so I figured we could spend the day together," he said while nudging him with his foot. Izuku was now also excited, and a big smile quickly grew on his face. He figured this was his father's way of cheering him up after his quirkless diagnosis a month ago. He looked over to his father, who was now walking over to his dresser. "Can we get ice cream?" Izuku asked while bouncing up and down. "I don't know yet. Maybe, depending on how the day goes," Hisashi said, throwing a random pair of shorts and a shirt that doesn't even remotely match onto his bed. "Now hurry up and get dressed. I don't want to waste even a second." Hisashi left the room, and Izuku paused for a second at the clothes thrown onto his bed. They didn't match in the slightest, and even his 4-year-old brain could see that, but he wasn't about to complain about something his dad handpicked out for him. Izuku stepped out of his room dressed and ready for the day. Hisashi didn't waste any time starting off their day as he began trying to force a quirk out of him. He beat him, dropped him, burned him, drowned him, and much, much more. He was convinced Izuku had a quirk that was just dormant and hadn't been activated yet, so he tried everything he could think of to try and draw the quirk out. And Izuku, who was too young and stupid to realize, went along with everything. Forcing Izuku to drink lighter fluid, his father then held an unlit match in front of Izuku. "I want you to swallow this. Then I want you to scream from your stomach and the back of your throat. Like this." His father breathed fire, lighting up the room with the orange blaze. Izuku's eyes sparkled with amazement. Hisashi brought the match to his mouth and softly blew on it, lighting it. "Just like that," he said, handing the match over. Izuku ached all over and felt sick to his stomach, but took the match with determination in his eyes. Watching the flame dance, Izuku threw the match in his mouth right before the fire touched his fingers. Burning the inside of his mouth for a second before swallowing the match, Izuku let out a dry, raspy scream. But nothing happened. Izuku felt his inside churn, so he screamed again. But instead of spitting up fire, it was last night's dinner. Holding his stomach after vomiting all over the kitchen floor, Izuku looked up at his father, expecting worry to be written on his face. Instead, he was met with rage. Hisashi slowly stood up. "Damned! Damned! Damn!" Izuku flinched from the sudden yelling from his father. "I can't have a son that is this worthless. I can't believe I wasted all my time and energy raising such a useless piece of shit." Izuku started crying and apologizing. His father kicked him, and his back hit one of the kitchen cabinets behind him. He felt his insides churn again, and trying to suppress the urge to vomit was futile. Hisashi continued to yell and kick him all, while Izuku cried, apologizing and begging his father to stop. Izuku felt a light kick to his side. "Come on, kid, get up. I didn't even hit you that hard this time." Izuku regrettably opened his eyes and looked at Stain, who was standing over him. "I guess we'll be done for today." Stain held out his hand, but Izuku ignored it, groaning as he slowly stood up. Izuku lifted his fist and held them in front of him. "I can keep going." Stain sat down in the sand and looked at the water and the setting sun. "I know, but I've got something planned later, and I recommend you take the break." Izuku sighed and reluctantly collapsed right next to him. Izuku had been training days and nights with him for about a month now. Stain had him doing anything from acrobatics and parkour to the ability to just read the opponent on the spot, which Izuku was already way overqualified for. Along with his ability to do flips and climb anything, Izuku also got flexible, making it a whole lot easier to dodge. While Stain did teach him stealth, he didn't go much into it. Just how to be quick to the point stealth wasn't completely needed. But out of all of it, Stain's main driving point and lesson was to get everything over with quickly without any drawn-out fights. Stain worked fast. He'd get what he needed to get done, then get out of there without much fighting necessary. But this was Stain's biggest weakness, and one of the things Izuku wanted to learn but not keep engraved in him. Knowing how to get things done fast, but also being able to withstand longer fights if called for. Training with Stain was a bit of a wake-up call. Although Izuku didn't want to be Stain's successor, that didn't mean he didn't agree with his ideology. Izuku knew more than anyone that there were a lot of heroes out there unfit to be heroes. Stain had just taken it into his own hands and started getting rid of those he deemed unfit. Along with that, Izuku would be doing one of the things he enjoyed doing most, killing heroes. Except now with a bit more rules, and he wasn't getting paid for it. It wasn't like he was really doing it for the money in the first place, but it was an added bonus that came with being contracted instead of handpicking who he killed. He honestly just didn't want the extra work that came with the title of the hero killer, even if he already was one. Izuku agreed with Stain, but he just didn't want to be his successor. The sun now set. Stain looked over to Izuku, who was sprawled out in the sand staring at the sky. "Run home and put on something dark. We're going out tonight." Izuku begrudgingly got up and grabbed his tool belt of knives before dragging himself through the sand. "I said run." Izuku looked back at Stain still sitting and staring at the water. Izuku stuck out his tongue at him. "Stop making faces and go," Stain said, not even caring. Izuku let out a sigh, too tired to try and figure out how Stain saw him with his back turned again. It's getting harder to convince him he doesn't have eyes on the back of his head. Picking up the pace, Izuku jogged home and threw on his vigilante outfit. It was dark and practical. This was the second time they were going out somewhere, but if the first time was anything to go by, then he's probably just going to have to watch and take mental notes as Stain kills another hero. Izuku jogged up to Stain, who was still sitting on the beach. "Did you read up on that hero I told you about?" Stain asked. "There was nothing special about her. She just grew and controlled plants," Izuku said, shrugging his shoulders. "She not meeting your hero expectations," Izuku mocked. Stain gave a low hum in response as he got up and started walking off the beach. "Sold a lot of pot to kids," Izuku said as an afterthought. Stain stopped in his tracks and swung around to face Izuku, his eyes wide with surprise. Izuku let out a small mocking laugh. "Did you not know that? You're sure it was her?" Stain turned back around and continued to stoically walk. "Yep, bought some from her just the other day," Izuku said, catching up and walking next to him. Stain looked down at him questioningly. "What?" "I didn't smoke any. Threw it at a homeless guy down the block. I just wanted to confirm it was her." They both silently walked to the train station and got on the train. "And you're sure it was her?" "Saw it with my own eyes." The two just sat in silence, ignoring all the stares and whispers from the few passengers that were riding the train this late at night, until something clicked in Izuku's mind, and he broke the silence. "Wait, so you really were just going to kill her because she didn't meet your hero expectations?" Izuku looked over to Stain, expecting him to disagree and give him a legitimate answer. Stain simply shrugged and rode the rest of the small trip in silence. Getting off the train, they climbed onto the closest building and started hopping across the roofs until they saw their target walking the streets. The hero Soil was dressed in casual clothes and looked to be walking home after shopping, as she carried many bags marked with logos from various places. Stain turned to Izuku. "She's all yours. You have an hour." Izuku, surprised at first, nodded and slipped on his mask that was laying around his neck. Climbing down into any alley, Izuku lay on the ground and waited for the hero to pass by before screaming out, as if in pain, pleading for someone to help him. Soil stopped in her tracks and peered into the dark alley and stared at Izuku. As if needing another reason to come help him, Izuku reached out to her as he fake begged for her help. Soil ran in and dropped her bags against the wall before kneeling next to Izuku. Checking for any obvious injuries, she asked, "What's wrong?" Izuku looked at her with a smile and said, "Nothing." She suddenly felt something sharp stab her abdomen. Looking down at her stomach, she saw red start to spread down her shirt. Pressing her hands over the wound, she tried to stop the bleeding. Producing plants with big leaves, she began ripping them off to cover her wound. In an act of protection, she also started surrounding herself with as many plants as she could muster, which wasn't very much in her wounded state. She suddenly froze when she felt the cold metal against her neck. Izuku pulled her head back with her hair so that she was looking up at him. Smiling down at her with an innocent childlike face, she started to cry. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Soil cried out as tears ran down the side of her face. Izuku just shrugged before his smile grew wider. His maniac smile was the last thing she saw as he sliced her neck with his knife and watched her body go limp on the ground and bleed out. Stain, watching the whole thing from the rooftop above him, almost patted himself on the back for picking Izuku out as his successor. He knew the kid could put up a fight, but to kill without hesitation. Not many people have that in them, for a good reason. The next day, they met on the beach. Izuku was sitting in the sand, half staring at the water and half marveling at his work. Although it wasn't even halfway done because of him getting sidetracked with Stain's training, The beach was still significantly cleaner compared to a month ago. Stain approached him from behind and lightly kicked him with his foot. "Get up, Brett, I've got something for you." Izuku tilted his head back to see Stain staring down at him, with him an extra blade in his hand. Not getting up, Izuku continued to stare out at the water and jokingly said, "You look like you're leaving." When Stain didn't answer, Izuku turned and faced him. "You're not leaving, right?" Stain sat down next to Izuku and extended the small sword to him. "It was a tanto. I wanted to give this to you. You don't have to use it, but don't throw it out as it was made for you." The sword was smaller than the one Stain had. It was black with highlights of dark green. "In the beginning, you had said you didn't wish to be my successor. Have you changed your mind at all?" Izuku looked down as he solemnly shook his head. "And that's okay. You're just leaving like that," Izuku said, squeezing the tanto in his hand until his knuckles turned white. "You killed the last of my 3 heroes last night. It's time for me to move cities." But Izuku's eyes were wide. Stain placed a hand on his shoulder. As much as he didn't want to admit it, he'd become rather attached to the kid as well, but all good things must come to an end. "Listen, kid, I've taught you all that I can. You learned quickly and absorbed all the knowledge and skills that I have shown you. There's nothing more I can really give you. You just need a bit of practice, and I'm sure you could refine those skills pretty quick." Stain stood up, and Izuku followed suit. "It was nice knowing you, kid," Stain said before walking off. Izuku watched as he walked off, but he didn't get very before yelling back to him, "If you ever change your mind, come find me." When Izuku yelled back, "How?" Stain chuckled to himself before yelling, "I'm sure you'll figure it out. You can be quite surprising when you put your mind to something." Izuku watched Stain fade out of view before sitting down and watching the water. Izuku wiped away the single tear that fell down his cheek. Staring at the tanto in his hand, he couldn't help but blurt out, "Why do people keep giving me blades before they leave?" Not that he was complaining. "You see, like here, Shoyuta pointed to a problem on Shinso's math page. You added when you were supposed to subtract." Shoyuta flipped the page over and wrote out the math problem. He then slowly talked his way through the problem, explaining each and every step and why he did it as he solved the problem. Circling the answer, he twisted the page around, so it was now facing Shinso. "You get it now. Simple mistakes that are easy to fix." Shinso nodded as he went over the problem in front of him. Shinso flipped the page over and scanned all the problems he got wrong, making little notes on the side. "Need anything else before I get going?" Shoyuta asked. Shinso looked up from his page and over to the clock. "Yeah, I'm leaving a little earlier than usual. I have to meet up with someone before I start my patrol." Shinso was confused for a second about how Shoyuta just read his mind, but just brushed it off. "Is it that vigilante you mentioned?" he asked. Shoyuta was taken aback a bit. He had forgotten he mentioned Nightwalker to Shinso. He shook his head and crossed his arms before looking up at Shinso. "Haven't seen him in a few weeks, and I'm afraid he might have gotten himself killed." "Why do you say that?" Shinso asked as he continued looking over his page of math. Shoyuta gave out a deep and almost sad sigh. "Besides that, on multiple occasions I have caught the kid jumping with the intent to end it all. There is also the fact that he's beyond reckless with his life. He'll just jump into these fights as if the guy isn't already 3 times his size." Shoyuta paused for a long second. "He seems to throw away his life as if it means nothing." Shinso looked up and gently placed down his pencil. Shoyuta's face was buried in his capture scarf, but out of nowhere, lasting only a second, a quiet chuckle filled the room. "But I have to admit that although he doesn't care about his life, he isn't an idiot." Shoyuta's mouth hung open ready to speak, but he couldn't help but be lost in his thoughts trying to find the words for this vigilante. He sat up a bit in his chair. "I don't know how to completely describe it to you, but this kid is smart and foolish all at the same time. Although he recklessly throws himself into danger, he doesn't do it right away. He sits for a few seconds, then just suddenly goes." Shoyuta said as he threw out his hands to gesture the motion. Was he trying to talk himself up or something? Give himself the confidence he needed before jumping in? Shinso curiously asked. Shoyuta sat forward with his arms folded on the table. "See, that's what I thought at first. I thought he was scared but still wanted to help anyways. But when I looked closer," Shoyuta leaned in a little, and Shinso, who was now invested, did so as well. Shoyuta tapped his ear, and his voice sounded deeper as he said in a quiet tone, and really listened. I realized the kid was analyzing the person and people in front of him. He wasn't going in blind, and yet he would still throw himself into these fights. Shoyuta said, almost amazed himself. So what? He probably has like an intelligent quirk or something. Shinso leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, intently listening. That's what I figured because I've never seen him outright use a quirk, but some of the things he would say, Shoyuta paused for a second trying to look for the words. His mind may rival even Nizu. Shinso raised a brow. Shoyuta would raise his eyebrows in awe of the kid as he continued to remember and talk about him, but furrow them seconds later. I only knew him for a short while, but I know he would have made a great hero. Shoyuta hunkered in on himself, looking defeated, as if he himself had put the Vigilante to death. They both sat in silence for a good minute before Shinso picked up his pencil. I think I've got it from here, Shinso said, shuffling around his papers trying to look busy. Shoyuta nodded and pushed himself up from the chair, ruffling Shinso's hair as he walked by him. Just then a cat hopped down from the couch, and a little jingle followed Shoyuta as he walked to the door. Circling his legs, Hope purred as Shoyuta reached down to pet the little white cat. At least try to look like you attempted to fall asleep this time, Shoyuta quipped to Shinso. How else am I supposed to learn new skills if I don't do it when I've got nothing better to do? I can't fall asleep anyway, so might as well do something productive with my time, Shinso remarked with a smirk. Hope walked over to Shinso and jumped up onto his lap. Just keep the baking to a minimum while I'm gone. I don't feel like coming home to the place burnt down. Shoyuta walked out the door, locking it behind him. Shoyuta popped his head into Sakkachi's office, only to find the man in the middle of chugging his freshly made coffee. He then poured himself another one and began to nurse it for a little bit, whispering sweet words to it in the hopes of nothing crazy happening that night. Sakkachi then proceeded to almost shot the drink. How many is that now? Shoyuta asked as he took the seat across from Sakkachi. I lost count after 5, Sakkachi said as he went to pour Shoyuta and himself a cup. This one he sipped more casually. You're here later than I expected. I was helping the kid out with homework. I've been meaning to ask how's he been doing. Is he still adjusting? Sakkachi asked as he opened a drawer right next to him. He's doing good. He definitely is a lot more comfortable than he was the first night he was there. He's become a lot more relaxed with me and his surroundings and no longer stays in his room all day. The other night, I came home to him trying to bake brownies. It was 3 a.m. Shoyuta pinched the bridge of his nose as he remembered the night. But I also don't feel like I'm doing anything right. I thought it was just like teaching another kid like at school, but I was way off. Sakkachi gave a soft chuckle. It's nice to know he's doing well and warmed up to you. He looked like a scared puppy the day you brought him in here. Sakkachi leaned forward and stared Shoyuta directly in the eyes and spoke in a quiet, serious voice. It's okay and normal for you to feel that way. No parent ever feels like they're doing it right, especially when it comes to raising a kid. But you're not raising a kid, Aizawa. As sad as it is to say, he's already essentially raised himself. What you're doing is guiding him and showing him the right path. And that's one of the things you do best, teaching job or not. Sakkachi pulled out a manila folder from his drawer and slid it over to Shoyuta. Parenting advice aside, now for why you're really here. Here are the files on the foster care you requested. Shoyuta hid his smile and his capture weapon as he began flipping through the pages in the folder. Did you find anything? Sakkachi solemnly shook his head. There's no record of this kid Shinso was living with. It was only Shinso living in that house. No one else. Shoyuta looked up at Sakkachi confused. There's no way he was lying about it. The look in his eye when he talks about this other kid. There's no way he's just making it up. I even registered it as true when he was talking about it, Sakkachi said, agreeing with Shoyuta. Sakkachi paused for a second before speaking up. But there have been cases where if they believe it to be true, my quirk will register it as true. Shoyuta looked up from the papers, staring Sakkachi in the eyes as he scowled and activated his quirk. The kid's not lying about this, he said in a low, gruff voice. Whoa. Sakkachi playfully put his hands up as he tried to calm Shoyuta down a bit. I'm not saying he's lying, just that there have been cases and it's not something we can completely rule out. Who knows, maybe someone went in and deleted any evidence the kid was there. Shuta's hair fell onto his face as he deactivated his quirk and looked at Sakkachi questioningly. It's a far-fetched idea, I know, I'm still trying to come up with ideas. How could Shinso be telling the truth, but there's no record of this kid? Takachi let out a laugh as the situation calmed down. You've really taken on the dad role in full stride. It's good to know the kid is in good hands even if I didn't already know you. Shoyuta didn't do as well to hide his smile this time, as he continued to look through the papers in the manila folder until he eventually got to the profile of a kid. He stared at the picture of the kid, and familiar-looking green eyes stared back at him. Shoyuta pointed at the page and looked up at Takachi. Who's this? Takachi looked at the page confused at first, but surprised when taking a look. Sorry, I must have placed it in the wrong folder. To answer your question, Midoriya was a kid who killed himself the other day by jumping from the roof of his school building. Takachi solemnly stated. Shoyuta saw the quirk status and understood why. He frowned even more than he already was when he saw the kid's age. He was only in middle school. Most quirkless don't make it past the age of 25, but to die at 14. They're discriminated against and beaten down physically and emotionally to the point that the only escape from it all is death. This kid was only in middle school, and the world around him was already unbearable. Shoyuta knew there was nothing he could have done. He didn't even know the kid, but he still felt like he was to be blamed for not being there for Hai. Takachi went to grab the paper away, but Shoyuta grabbed it back with a quick, hold on. Something about Midoriya's first name reminded him of something. He had never heard of or met an Izuku, but there was just something about it that he couldn't quite describe. Then it clicked. The first two initials from when Shinso slipped up about the name of his friend was Iz. Midoriya was the same age as Shinso. His mother died, and if he wasn't staying with his father, who was already out of the picture then, he would have been put into foster care. Shinso said it was only a short time together, and Midoriya's mother died a few months before Shinso ran away. So Midoriya could have been in the same foster home with Shinso for about a month or two before running away, and Shinso soon following. Shoyuta looked up, almost excited that he had pieced all this together. You still got access to the foster care files online? Takachi raised his eyebrows questioningly. Yeah, why? Shoyuta flipped the page of Midoriya around, so it was facing the detective and tapped his finger on the picture. I need you to look this kid up in M. See if he was in the foster care system at all. Although definitely confused at first, Takachi typed in the name and waited for the file to pop up. But nothing came up. There was no Izuku Midoriya that had gone into the foster care system. Takachi turned around in his chair to face Shoyuta, who had at some point walked around the desk. Nothing, huh? Shoyuta sighed, looking defeated. He must have stayed with his dad then. I guess so. Shoyuta shrugged his shoulders as he walked around the desk and back to his seat. They were back at square one, but he was a little relieved. Shoyuta couldn't even imagine having to break the news to Shinso that this kid they were looking for was dead. At least now, there's still a chance that the kid they're looking for is alive, somewhere. He closed the manila folder and slid it back to Takachi. Thanks for getting the files, even if they were kind of useless in the end. I gotta get going, my patrol starts soon. Shoyuta picked up his cup of coffee and chugged it. I'll continue to look whenever I've got time. Takachi pulled out the paper on the Midoriya kid and held it up. For now, what do you want me to do with this? Is it staying in the missing foster kid folder? Shoyuta paused and thought. I don't know. I've got this feeling about him. Even if he isn't the kid we're looking for, there's just something about him. I feel like I've seen him before. Takachi opened a new drawer and took out an empty folder. He placed the paper of Midoriya in the new folder and then put both Shinso's missing kid and Midoriya's folders in the drawer next to him. I'll look more into the kid and see what else I can find. Shoyuta nodded and then simply left, closing the door to Takachi's office behind him. The night was a little brisk, but still as beautiful as ever. It was a rather quiet and slow night compared to usual, but he wasn't about to complain. Shoyuta was hopping along the rooftops when he stopped on one particular building. The view of the city was amazing, and he decided it would be an okay time to take a break. Shoyuta sat down near the edge and pulled out a jelly pouch from one of his pockets. He ate as he just stared off into the distance, admiring the view. I've always liked the city view at night. A voice came from right next to Shoyuta. Shoyuta choked on his food for a second as he quickly got up and jumped backward away from the individual. There was no way he had gotten so distracted that someone was able to sneak up on him. It's not possible. No one's ever been able to sneak up on him. He's too hyper-aware of everything going on around him at every hour of the day. Whoever it was, they weren't to be messed with. Shoyuta readied his scarf. The individual hadn't even moved yet and was just staring off into the view of the city, hands in their pocket. But something looked familiar about them, the way they stood and the color of the hoodie. Shoyuta relaxed, but didn't lower his scarf quite yet. Kid? Nightwalker? The one and only. What's up, Eraser? Been a while, hasn't it? The Vigilante said in a playful tone as he turned around to face Shoyuta. Shoyuta let go of his scarf and dropped his hands as he moved closer, happy to see the Vigilante. Where have you been? I thought you were dead. Nightwalker chuckled as if he had told a joke, then just shrugged his shoulders. I don't know, around, I guess. I got busy doing other stuff. It didn't answer much, but it was something. It was just good to know he was alive. But that brought up more questions. How? How what? Sneak up on you? Shoyuta nodded. How? Let's just say I've been practicing. Although the kid's face was covered, Shoyuta could definitely tell there was a shit-eating grin formed behind that mask. Katsuki dragged his exhausted body to school. It had been about a month and a half since the accident, but it still felt like it happened just the other day. They weren't even that close, especially toward the end. And yet Izuku is all that occupied his thoughts. Izuku plagued his mind, and it was hard not to think about him and how sorry he was. For about a week after Izuku's death, Katsuki didn't attend school. He couldn't sleep and would go days without it. His parents had thought it was from the grief. While that was partly true, it was mainly from the guilt. He couldn't close his eyes for too long without thinking of Izuku. It was his fault he wasn't here. His fault he was dead. About 5 days after the accident, Katsuki's knees gave out from fatigue, and he was too tired to lift his body up once on the ground. Exhausted, he closed his eyes. Sleep immediately consumed him, but for once his mind remained blank, too tired to even dream. He woke up on the floor with a blanket draped over him about 18 hours later and was sore for the next week. His parents didn't want to move him into the bed, afraid he might wake up. Katsuki sauntered into the class a few minutes after the bell rang. He tried to stand tall and look as confident as he could, but he was just too tired and just not in the mood. Walking to the back of the class, he stood next to a desk located next to the window and stared down the kid already sitting in the seat. Katsuki's face was rested in a scowl, and the dark circles under his eyes only proved to make his face more intimidating. Katsuki opened his mouth to speak and ask if he could switch seats. But the kid was already scrambling to collect his things, apologizing profusely. Katsuki stood next to it for a few seconds debating if he actually wanted it anymore, but ultimately was too tired. He sat down and stared out the window the entire rest of the day. That's all he did when he came to school from then on. He stopped paying attention to the teacher during lectures and stopped bothering to do any work during or after class. He did nothing but show up, yet his grades never lowered and teachers never scolded him. He never got talked to about it and no one questioned him. He was never beaten after class or smacked by the teachers. Nothing happened to him, but Katsuki almost wished something did. Katsuki only came to school to get out of the house, and in the hopes of some sort of a distraction. Instead, he was annoyed by the people that used to follow by his side. The extras would crowd his desk and make jokes with each other or talk about the kids they were going to give a talking to after school. At first, he just ignored them with the expectation that they would just go away eventually and stop bothering him. They never did. They kept trying to include Katsuki and get him to join in even if he hadn't participated in any of that in weeks or even months. It was Bakugo this and Bakugo that. Bakugo, there's this new kid. Bakugo, you should have seen it. Bakugo after school today. Bakugo. 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 Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Katsuki snapped. His hands stretched out, palms up, popping explosions as he yelled. Stop crowding my desk, you shitty extras. I don't give a F, leave me alone, and go somewhere else for once in your sorry lives. I'm sick and tired of you bothering me every minute of the day. Katsuki yelled, startling some of the class at the sudden outburst. Although scared at first, all those who surrounded his desk looked at him with disgust before walking away and to their own seats. The teacher walked in, and Katsuki dropped into his seat and looked out the window, just trying to calm down. He was partially zoned out while looking at a tree when a wad of green caught his attention by the school gate. Deck! Izuku walked past the front gate, but then disappeared behind a wall. Katsuki looked around the entrance of the school for any sign of him again, but there was nothing. Great, now he was starting to lose his mind. There's no way that was Izuku, right? Just someone that looked like him. Katsuki nodded to himself, trying to reassure himself of the idea. A week later, Katsuki walked into class. All the extras were laughing and talking as loud as they possibly could, but the minute he walked in, everyone shut up. A few were snickering to themselves and whispering, but most were quiet. They all stared at him as he entered, but the gaze was different than what he was used to. He was used to the eyes and the awe-filled praise, but this wasn't that. Was it pity? Why now of all times? Katsuki walked over to his desk, but came to a halt when out the window was Izuku. Across the street from the school, just standing in the middle of the sidewalk, Izuku stood dressed in his school uniform. Hair was covering his eyes, preventing Katsuki from seeing them, but he knew they were staring right at him. Staring into him. Katsuki couldn't move. He blinked a few times, but there Izuku stood. Katsuki rubbed at his eyes and massaged his temple, but Izuku never left. He wasn't disappearing. Why won't he leave? The snickering going on in the back erupted into laughs. Katsuki looked around, startled out of this daze Izuku had put him in. Was everyone seeing him too? Mocking him for it? Why are you laughing? Izuku's dead. It was his fault. It didn't take him long to understand why the extras were laughing. Weak was written in big, bold letters across his desk. Yet Katsuki couldn't help but stare at the letters. They were right. He was weak. Balling up his fists at his side, beads of sweat falling from his face. Katsuki's gaze fixed onto the desk. Weak. Izuku was dead because he was weak. Too weak to stand up to the monster that he created in and of himself. Katsuki sorrowfully looked out the window, but Izuku was no longer there. Katsuki sat down, but didn't stare out the window this time. He focused on the word written across his desk, never covering it up or washing it off even when he left school. Izuku continued to torment him, and if he wasn't plaguing his mind, the ghost of him was standing outside staring at him. Katsuki walked into class a few days later to the chalk eraser landing on his head. Stunned at first, he stood there for what felt like a minute. He chucked the eraser at the board at the front of the classroom. A plume of dust burst out as it hit the board, leaving a light patch of white. The old him would be yelling and popping his explosions as he glared down at everyone trying to figure out who did it. Instead, he just took a seat and tried to ignore the eyes of everyone around him and waited until class ended. Pranks only got worse and more violent as the weeks went on, but no one stepped forward and Katsuki did nothing about it. Katsuki walked out of the bathroom and shook the water from his hands. As he walked back to class, just around the corner from the bathroom was a kid getting beat on by an extra with some rock quirk. The old one would have joined in and really taught this poor kid a lesson. The extra was even looking at him as if he was asking him to. Katsuki paused and made eye contact with the kid. He looked rather boring and probably had some mundane quirk. He looked at Katsuki with the most terrified expression, as if he was scared Katsuki was going to join in. Instead, Katsuki looked at the onyx-looking extra. He tried to look intimidating like he used to be, but honestly, he felt just as weak and scared as the boring kid being beaten. Yo, Bakugo, the onyx extra took a step back. Were you looking to join in? Go ahead. He all but handed him over with a smile on his face. Leave him be. Katsuki glared at the onyx kid. Onyx was surprised for a second, but quickly turned angry. No, he stated. Let him go. No, Onyx stood tall in front of Katsuki. He pushed Katsuki back. Stumbling a bit, he fixed himself and tried to glare, but it wasn't as intimidating as it once was. No longer carrying the authority in it. Fine, do whatever. Katsuki proceeded to walk off, but paused when he heard the onyx extra call him a weak ass. He looked at the ground and tried to ignore it, but the extra was right. All he is weak. 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 Too weak to even stand up to someone that he used to consider below him. Katsuki walked back to class and sat down. He stared at his desk, and Weak stared back at him. That's all he's ever been. He's never once been strong, so why did he ever think he was? Because of his quirk? Izuku saved him from a legit villain without even using one. Because he was stronger than everyone? Izuku held on for years, getting beating after beating without even shedding so much as a tear. Because he was better than everyone? He was just a weak-minded brat that couldn't accept help from others. He was no hero, Just a weak kid that killed someone that didn't deserve the hand Katsuki had dealt him. It had been about a month and a half since the pranks and the ridicule and Izuku's torment from the grave started happening. Katsuki got home and threw his bag to a corner of his room and fell face first onto his bed. His mom yelled for him from downstairs. Grumbling out an old hag, as he got up, Green caught the corner of his eye from out his window. Izuku stood next to a tree covered in blood. Time seemed to slow as Katsuki froze and his breathing quickened. He watched in slow motion as the blood dripped from Izuku's hair. It streamed down his face and dripped from his chin as it splattered to the floor. Izuku reached out to him, and more blood fell from his arm and hand. "No," Katsuki said, shaking his head. "No, no, 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 no." Katsuki began to yell each "no," gradually getting louder until it eventually just led to a scream. Katsuki stepped backward away from the window as much as he could. Tripping on his own feet, he fell to the floor as he screamed, "Stop. Go away." Katsuki backed up as far as he could away from the window until he hit a wall. Bringing his knees to his chest, he squeezed his eyes shut. "Stop. Go away," he yelled at the window. His throat was raw, and that's when the tears began. Katsuki put his head between his legs and cried out, "I'm sorry, it was my fault," over and over again. Mitsuki burst through the door to her son, visibly shaking against the wall as he cried and yelled. Kneeling down in front of him, she shook him as hard as he could, but Katsuki continued. "Katsuki!" Mitsuki yelled. "Katsuki!" But nothing. She raised her hand and brought it down on the back of his head as hard as she could, jolting Katsuki and stopping the yelling. He looked up at his mom's worried look and tears running down her face. "Katsuki, what the hell?" He just stared at her. Mitsuki grabbed his face and pulled it around as she gave him a look over. She then pulled him into a tight hug. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" She spoke in a rough tone, her voice getting quieter as she talked. She pulled away, and he stared up at her. Tears slowly fell out of his eyes. "It's my fault he's dead. It's my..." Tears poured down his face even more quicker. "It's my fault he's..." Mitsuki pulled him into another hug, holding him as tight as she could. "No, it's not," she said in a soft voice. This only made Katsuki cry more. Katsuki leaned against her and just cried for what seemed like hours until the tears finally ran out and the crying ceased. She then ushered him to bed, and he passed out upon hitting the pillow. Katsuki got pushed down the stairs by one of the extras. He could have used his quirk to catch and stable himself, but he deserved it. He's been pushed and shoved, punched and kicked. No one has given him a full-on beatdown, just little accidents that are rougher than usual and leave bigger bruises, black eyes, and bloody noses. Katsuki just accepted it like it was a necessity he needed to receive. He sat at the bottom of the stairs and looked to the top to see a few extras just standing there glaring down at him with contempt in their eyes. "TCH. Not much of a hero now, are you?" one of them said. "Little baby Bakugo," another mocked. "Better hope UA accepts people on course alone. That's all you've got going for you." Katsuki watched them walk away and was stumped. He had forgotten all about going UA, all about being a hero. Did he still even want to be one? Could he after everything he's done? Dusting himself off, he walked to class and dazed off out the window. Izuku walked by the school gate, and Katsuki froze at his presence, but was otherwise unfazed at the moment. After what he's done to Izuku, how could he ever want to be a hero? He doesn't deserve the limelight or the fame. He has no right to win the #1 spot. He has no right to become a hero. So why does he still feel this burning fire inside of him, pushing him? Katsuki didn't understand. Why was there still this flame inside of him? Yes, he hadn't necessarily given up, just lost interest in a sense, as well as gained some reason. He shouldn't become a hero if he can't even be called one. A hero doesn't snuff out someone else's flame. A hero doesn't kill a friend. So why was this fire still lit inside of him when it should have long been put out? Katsuki was walking out of school when he heard what he thought was a fight break out around the corner. He usually wouldn't care, but it was in the direction he was going. Peeking his head around the corner, he saw 3 extras beating on this kid. Katsuki locked eyes with the kid getting beat on and realized it was the same kid from before from outside the bathroom. Izuku's bloody corpse laying on the ground beneath him flashed through his mind as he stared at this kid. Katsuki's body moved on its own, and suddenly he was standing in between the kid and the 3 extras. With his back to the kid, he glared down at the 3 extras in front of him. It was the Onyx extra again, but this time accompanied by some extra with large puffy fists and an extra with longest fingers. "Bakugo move," Onyx said. "No," Katsuki firmly stated as he threw his hands up at his sides to block the kid. "Then you get what's coming to you," Fist spoke up as he socked Katsuki in the face. Fingers kicked his shin, causing Katsuki to kneel on the ground. Onyx then punched him across the face. They continued to punch and kick him even as he curled in on himself and lay on the ground. As each blow hit, all Katsuki could think was, "I deserve this." "Kacchan," Izuku yelled. He ran as fast as his little legs could take him over to Katsuki, who was on the ground staring up at these 2 7-year-old boys. Katsuki was covered in bruises and honestly didn't remember why he picked a fight with them in the first place. They were older than him by 3 whole years, and he didn't even know them besides occasionally seeing them at the park. Izuku came to a halt between him and the older boys and threw out his arms. "Don't worry, Kacchan, because I am here," Izuku said as he planted his feet and looked up at the bullies. Izuku looked like a real hero even if his quirk hadn't come in yet. Of course, Izuku got pummeled seconds later by the bullies. Tears streamed down his face, and his knees were scraped and bleeding, but Katsuki watched as Izuku stood back up. He was glowing, and even if Katsuki couldn't see his face, he knew there was a giant smile on it even as tears ran down it. Katsuki stood up covered in forming bruises and a bloody nose as he glared down at the 3 extras. He held out his hands as he began setting off his quirk. The extras stood tall and unmoving, but so did Katsuki. The Onyx extra formed rocks around his hand and sent a punch aimed at Katsuki's face. He dodged and let out an explosion a few centimeters from Onyx's face, but either he was too close to his face or the explosion was bigger than usual because afterward, a loud ringing sounded in Katsuki's ear. Onyx fell backward after being kicked in the gut and into one of the other extras before falling to the ground. They all stared at him with wide eyes, surprised by the sudden reaction. They all yelled at him, but the ringing made it impossible to hear anything they were saying. The 2 standing ran, and Onyx on the ground soon followed. One of the bullies pushed Katsuki to the ground before running off. He watched both boys cry as they ran to their mothers. He didn't care, though. They deserved what Katsuki handed to them. He heard shuffling next to him, and he looked over to Izuku getting up and walking over to him. He held out a hand to Katsuki with a huge smile on his face. "See, Kacchan, I told you everything would be all right." Katsuki took his best friend's hand and stood up. They both broke out in a fit of giggles. The loud, ringing slowly died down as he rubbed around his ears until it eventually went away, but the world seemed quieter than before. Katsuki turned around to face the kid that was sitting against the wall covered in scrapes and bruises. Katsuki held out a hand for the kid. He looked up at him, shock written all over his face, but fear as well. The kid slowly lifted his hand, hesitating before placing it into Katsuki's. Gripping his hand, Katsuki pulled the kid up, so he was now standing. He was quiet as he stared at Katsuki. "It's all right now. You don't have to worry," Katsuki said as he placed a hand on the kid's shoulder. "Thank you." Katsuki only gave him a nod, but something inside of him burned a little brighter. Katsuki didn't understand at first why there was still a flame, but knew there had to be a reason, and now he thinks he finally understood why. Before he wanted to be a hero, because that's what he had to be. That's what his quirk was best for, and what people pushed him towards, but he was focused on the wrong things. Now he wants to help people, to save people, to not care about the spotlight, but instead to keep everyone alive. To be there for everyone that needs a hero. That's the kind of hero he wants to be. He wants to become more like the hero Izuku was supposed to be. The next day, before anyone showed up, Katsuki walked into class early with a wipe for his desk. When he walked into the classroom, he was surprised to find the kid he helped out yesterday, standing over his desk, wiping it off. Apparently, they'd had the same idea. "What are you doing?" Katsuki asked as he walked up to his desk. The kid stared at the desk, and the week written on it then looked up at Katsuki. "It's wrong." Katsuki was taken aback at first, but then a small smirk lifted the corner of his mouth, and the kid gave him a nod. The kid held out his hand. Ikarinara my name. I don't know if you know it or not. Katsuki took his hand and shook it, then picked back up the spray bottle. Well, you're not going to get very far with a Sorius paper towel and some water, Katsuki said as he sprayed something onto the desk and wiped the word away. Everyone eventually arrived, and class soon began. Katsuki still didn't care about doing any work, but today he looked forward. He knows he saw Izuku pass by the school gate and stand and stare at him, but Katsuki didn't look out the window. Class ended, and when Katsuki did eventually look out the window, Izuku was long gone. Izuku passed by the school, once again wearing his school uniform as per usual, hair covering his eyes. It had gotten rather long, so it was quite easy to do. Most days he had it pulled back or up, but to really add to the bit he kept it down, making him look more dead. He stared up at Bakugo in the classroom, but this time he never looked. Izuku did his little walk by and stood on the sidewalk, but not even a glance. What had changed? Bakugo always looked at him and would get terrified each time. It was the highlight of his day for a while. Izuku tried again the next day, but again nothing. The day after that he went to his house covered in blood again, but Bakugo just closed his curtains. Well, this wasn't fun anymore. Izuku washed up and changed along the way as he headed to the beach. Might as well do a little more cleaning before heading off into the night. Thank you for joining us on this journey through What If Deku Became the Most Feared Villain. We hope you found it as captivating as we did. A big thank you to Toast the Spaghetti in the Oven for creating such an engaging story. Don't forget to visit their profile on archive of our own.org for more fantastic works. The link is in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Zenin Fanfics for more intriguing explorations into fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we love hearing your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section. See you soon in the next video.